The fall should have killed her, but what came after almost destroyed her family. When a sheltered ranch heiress crashes into the unforgiving desert, the quiet stranger who saves her life becomes the man the entire town wants to condemn. One broken leg, one forbidden night, one choice that will tear everything apart. This is a story about survival, prejudice, and the courage to stand against a world determined to keep you in your place. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The horse knew before Clara did, its ears flattened backward, nostrils flaring wide as the rattlesnake's buzz cut through the afternoon heat like a blade. Clara Whitmore felt the animal's muscles coil beneath her, felt the split-second tension that separated control from chaos, and then the world exploded into motion. She didn't scream. There wasn't time. The mare reared, hooves clawing at empty air, and Clara's gloved hands lost their grip on the reins. For one terrible, weightless moment, she hung suspended between sky and earth, her silk riding jacket brilliant against the pale desert sun. And then gravity remembered her. She hit the ground with a sound that shouldn't come from a human body. The impact drove every whisper of air from her lungs. Pain detonated through her left leg, white-hot and absolute, spreading upward like wildfire through dry timber. Somewhere in the distance, she heard her horse's retreating hoofbeats, the rhythm growing fainter until the desert swallowed the sound completely. Silence rushed in to fill the void. Clara lay on her back, staring up at a sky so blue it hurt, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. Her breath came in shallow, broken gasps. When she tried to move her left leg, agony slammed through her with such force that darkness crowded the edges of her vision. Don't pass out. Don't you dare pass out. She was 5 miles from the ranch house, maybe 6. She'd ridden out alone despite her father's warnings, desperate for an afternoon away from wedding preparations, from her mother's endless scrutiny, from the suffocating weight of being James Whitmore's only daughter and the future wife of Senator Morrison's son. Now, lying broken in the dirt with the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, those warnings seemed less like overprotection and more like prophecy. Clara managed to prop herself up on her elbows. The movement sent fresh waves of nausea rolling through her stomach. Her leg, her beautiful riding boot split along the seam, lay at an angle that made her gorge rise, bone pressed against skin from the inside, a white shadow beneath the fabric of her riding pants. "Help!" she whispered, then louder. "Help!" The desert absorbed her voice like water into sand. She tried again, screaming now, pouring everything she had into that single word. Birds scattered from a distant mesquite tree. The hawk adjusted its flight path. Nothing else moved. This is how I die, she thought, and the clarity of it was almost peaceful. Alone in the desert, 3 weeks before my wedding, because I couldn't stand one more afternoon of being told how to smile. The sun dropped lower. Shadows lengthened across the sand, stretching toward her like dark fingers. The pain in her leg had evolved from acute agony into a deep, throbbing presence that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. She knew enough about injuries to understand that the bone had broken cleanly through. A compound fracture. Without treatment, infection would set in, if she didn't bleed out first. Clara fumbled at her jacket pocket, pulling out the small silver whistle her father had insisted she carry. Her fingers trembled as she raised it to her lips and blew. The sound pierced the air, sharp and desperate. She blew again, and again, until her lungs burned and her vision swam and she had to stop or risk passing out entirely. In the terrible quiet that followed, she heard something that didn't belong to the desert. Footsteps. Slow, measured, coming from somewhere beyond the outcropping of red rock to her left. "Here," Clara's voice cracked. "I'm here, please." The figure that emerged from behind the rocks moved like a part of the landscape itself, quiet, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. He was tall, lean in a way that spoke of hard work rather than deprivation, dressed in worn canvas pants and a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. Dark hair touched his collar. His skin was the deep bronze of someone who lived beneath the sun, but it was his eyes that stopped Clara's breath, dark, steady, taking in every detail of her situation in a single sweeping glance that seemed to calculate distances, assess dangers, measure odds. He didn't ask if she was all right. The question would have been stupid, And this man didn't look like he wasted words on stupid questions. How long? His voice was low, roughened by disuse or dust or both. I don't know. Clara tried to keep the panic from her voice. An hour, maybe? The sun was higher when I fell. He approached slowly, each step deliberate, giving her time to object to his presence. When he knelt beside her, she caught the scent of sage and leather, and something clean, like rain on rock. Ethan Redhawk, he said, and it took Clara a moment to realize he was introducing himself. I'm going to touch your leg. It's going to hurt. It already hurts. It's going to hurt more. His hands moved over her boot with surprising gentleness, fingers probing the leather, finding the seam. When he looked up at her again, something in his expression had shifted, a tightness around his eyes that might have been concern on a more expressive face. Compound fracture, he said. Tibia's broken through. You're losing blood into the surrounding tissue. That's why your leg's swelling inside the boot. If I leave the boot on during transport, the swelling could cut off circulation. If I remove it now, the bone might shift and tear an artery. Clara stared at him. Which means? Means I need to stabilize it here before we move you. And that's going to hurt worse than anything you've felt in your entire life. How do you know what I've felt? For the first time, something that might have been a smile ghosted across his features. You're a Whitmore. People like you don't know real pain. The words should have stung. Instead, lying broken in the dirt, Clara found them almost funny. People like me, she echoed. What does that mean? Means you've got soft hands and clean nails and probably never spent a day wondering where your next meal was coming from. He was already moving, pulling a knife from his belt and cutting strips from the bottom of his own shirt. Means in about 5 minutes you're going to understand why that matters. He worked quickly, gathering straight branches from a nearby shrub, testing them for strength. His movements were economical, practiced. This wasn't the first time he'd done this. Clara watched through a haze of pain and shock as he constructed a makeshift splint, binding the wood together with strips of fabric. What's your name? He asked, not looking up from his work. Clara Whitmore. I know who you are, Miss Whitmore. The whole valley knows who you are. Question is whether you're tough enough to handle what comes next. Before she could respond, he moved back to her leg. His hands hovered over her boot, fingers spread wide. I need you to stay conscious, he said. Can you do that? Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Look at me. Not at your leg. At me. He waited until her eyes met his. Tell me about your wedding. My what? You're getting married. To Morrison's son. The whole town's talking about it. Tell me about the dress. Why do you want to know about... His hands closed around her calf, and the world turned white. The scream tore out of Clara's throat before she could stop it, raw and animal. Ethan's fingers worked with brutal efficiency, stabilizing the bone, preventing it from shifting as he positioned the splint. Every nerve in her body seemed to catch fire simultaneously. She tried to pull away, but his grip was iron-strong, implacable. The dress, he repeated, voice calm despite the violence of what he was doing. Tell me about the dress. French, Clara gasped, tears streaming down her face. French lace, imported silk, oh God. Keep talking. Mother ordered it from New York 6 months ago. Her vision darkened at the edges. Hand-beaded, thousands of pearls. Stay with me, Clara. The use of her first name cut through the pain like a lifeline. She grabbed onto it, onto his voice, onto the strange steadiness in those dark eyes. The train is 12 feet long. Her words came in broken fragments now. She says I'll look like royalty. Almost done. His hands moved with impossible gentleness now, securing the splint with the fabric strips, testing the tightness with careful fingers. When he finally sat back on his heels, sweat had darkened his hairline despite the cooling air. That'll hold until we get you to shelter, he said. Clara's laugh came out broken, edged with hysteria. Shelter? The ranch is 6 miles. Not taking you to the ranch. Sun's going down and moving you that far could kill you. My cabin's 2 miles west. He was already shifting position, sliding one arm beneath her shoulders, the other under her knees. This is going to hurt. Everything hurts. Then a little more won't matter. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing, rising smoothly to his feet with Clara cradled against his chest. The movement jarred her leg, and she bit down on her lip hard enough to taste blood, refusing to scream again. Her fingers clutched at his shirt, finding purchase in the rough cotton. "I should tell my family," she managed. "They'll be worried." "They'll be more worried if you die of shock and exposure in the desert." Ethan adjusted his grip, settling her more securely. "We'll send word when you're stable." He started walking, his stride steady despite her weight. The sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust. Clara's head lolled against his shoulder, her consciousness flickering like a candle in wind. "Why were you out here?" she whispered. "Checking trap lines." "For what?" "Food. Same reason anyone sets traps." The simplicity of the answer highlighted the vast distance between their worlds. Clara had never trapped food in her life, never needed to. The closest she'd come to understanding survival was managing the household accounts, and even that was more theoretical than practical. "Thank you," she said, "for helping me." Ethan didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice carried a weight that Clara's pain-fogged mind couldn't quite decipher. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Whitmore. Come morning, you might wish I'd left you in the desert." The cabin emerged from the gathering dusk like something carved from the landscape itself. Low, weathered wood that had bleached to the color of bone, a stone chimney rising from one end. No fence, no garden, nothing that spoke of permanence or comfort. Just shelter, stark and functional. Ethan shouldered open the door, ducking slightly to clear the frame. Inside, the single room was spare to the point of severity. A narrow bed against one wall, a table with 2 chairs, a pot-bellied stove that had seen better decades. No curtains on the windows. No rugs on the plank floor. Nothing decorative, nothing soft. He laid Claire on the bed with the same careful efficiency he'd used to splint her leg. The mattress was thin but clean, the blanket rough wool that smelled of wood smoke. "Gonna cut away your boot now," he said, already reaching for his knife. "Need to see how bad the swelling is." Clara nodded mutely, beyond words now. The pain had evolved into something monstrous, a living thing that consumed all her attention. She watched through half-closed eyes as Ethan slit the leather from ankle to knee, peeling it away with gentle fingers that seemed at odds with the hardness of his face. Her leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, mottled with bruises already deepening to purple and black. The bone's outline was visible beneath the skin, a ridge that shouldn't exist. Ethan's jaw tightened. Going to need to reduce the fracture properly. Reset the bone. Can't let it heal crooked. "Can you do that?" Clara's voice sounded distant to her own ears. "Done it before. On myself, once. On a ranch hand who got kicked by a horse. On a hunting dog with more sense than its owner." He moved to the stove, building a fire with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. "Question is whether you can handle it." "Do I have a choice?" "No." The honest answer steadied something in Clara's chest. She was so tired of pretty lies, of reassurances that meant nothing. This man, this stranger, offered her only truth, brutal and clean. "Then do it," she said. Ethan heated water, washing his hands with soap that smelled of lye. He tore strips from a sheet, his only sheet, Clara realized, and laid out tools on the table with the precision of a surgeon. Knife, whiskey bottle, more strips of clean cloth. "This is going to be worse than before," he warned, returning to her side. "When I manipulate the bone back into position, you're probably going to pass out. That's fine. Better, actually, but I need you conscious long enough to drink this first." He held out the whiskey bottle. Clara had never tasted hard liquor in her life. Her father kept brandy in his study for important guests, and champagne appeared at celebrations, but whiskey was something rough men drank in saloons. The smell alone made her stomach turn. She took the bottle and drank anyway. Fire poured down her throat, stealing her breath. She coughed, sputtered, forced down another swallow. And another. Warmth spread through her chest, dulling the sharp edges of pain just slightly. "More," Ethan instructed. "I'll be sick." "Drink." She drank until he took the bottle away, until the room tilted gently around her and her tongue felt thick in her mouth. Through the alcoholic haze, she watched him position himself at the foot of the bed. hands settling on either side of her calf. "Look at the ceiling," he said. "Count the boards." Clara turned her head obediently, focusing on the rough-hewn planks above her. 1, 2, 3. Ethan's hands moved. The scream that tore from Clara's throat didn't sound human. It was pure agony given voice, primal and terrible. Her entire body arched off the bed, every muscle locked rigid as Ethan manipulated the bone with brutal, necessary force. She felt it grind, felt it shift, felt the awful wrongness as he realigned the fragments with hands that knew exactly what they were doing and refused to stop until the work was done. Darkness swooped in on black wings. She surrendered to it gratefully. When Clara surfaced again, night had fallen completely. The cabin's single window showed nothing but darkness pressed against the glass. A lamp burned on the table, casting long shadows up the walls. The pain in her leg had changed, still present, still monstrous, but somehow more manageable, as though her body had accepted this new reality and learned to breathe around it. Ethan sat in one of the chairs, watching her with those steady dark eyes. "You were out for 3 hours," he said. "Bones set. Splints secure. You'll need to stay off it completely for at least 6 weeks." 6 weeks. Clara's mind reeled at the timeline, at all the implications. The wedding is the least of your concerns right now. He rose, moving to the stove where a pot of something simmered. "You need to eat. Build your strength back up." "I'm not hungry." "Didn't ask if you were hungry. Said you need to eat." He ladled stew into a bowl, rabbit, by the smell of it, with wild onions and some kind of root vegetable. When he brought it to her, Clara struggled to sit up, gasping as the movement jarred her leg. Ethan's hand appeared at her back, supporting her weight, adjusting the pillow behind her shoulders with an impersonal tenderness that was somehow more intimate than any touch she'd ever experienced. The stew was simple, almost bland, but Clara's body responded to it with desperate hunger. She managed half the bowl before exhaustion claimed her again. "My family," she whispered. "They need to know." "I'll ride to the ranch at first light. Tell them where you are, what happened." "They'll come for me." "Probably." Something in his tone made her look up sharply. In the lamplight, Ethan's features were all shadows and sharp angles, unreadable as stone. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard experience. "Your family owns half the valley, Miss Whitmore. Your father sits on every bank board within 100 miles. Your fiancé's father is a senator with ambitions for governor." He met her eyes directly. "And you just spent the night in a cabin with a man the town calls the Indian. Alone. Unchaperoned." Understanding crashed over Clara like cold water. Her reputation, her carefully constructed future, everything her mother had spent 23 years building, all of it potentially destroyed by circumstance and a stranger's kindness. "They'll say," she began, "they'll say what people always say." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something bitter crept into his voice. "That I took advantage, that you were helpless, that men like me can't be trusted around women like you. That's not fair." "Fair's got nothing to do with it." Clara stared at him. This quiet man who'd saved her life without hesitation, who'd set her broken bone with skilled hands, who'd given her his only bed and his only blanket while he sat watch in a hard wooden chair. The injustice of it burned in her chest. "I'll tell them the truth," she said firmly. "I'll tell them exactly what happened. That you saved my life, that you treated me with nothing but respect, that without you I'd be dead in the desert." "Will they believe you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Clara didn't want to examine too closely. Would they believe her? Her father, maybe. Her mother, who measured everything by its impact on social standing. Her fiancé, who saw her more as a valuable acquisition than a person. "They'll have to," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Ethan rose, moving to check the fire in the stove. "Get some sleep, Miss Whitmore. Morning comes early, and you've got a long road ahead of you." "Clara," she said softly, "you've already seen me at my worst. You can call me Clara." He paused, his back to her, shoulders tense beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. "Sleep, Miss Whitmore. That's the best thing you can do right now." The dismissal was clear, but not unkind. Clara settled back against the pillow, her exhausted body already pulling her toward unconsciousness despite the pain, despite her racing thoughts, despite the growing certainty that this night, this single, strange night in a stranger's cabin, had changed the trajectory of her entire life. As she drifted off, she heard Ethan moving quietly through the cabin, banking the fire, checking the door, settling into the other chair with a blanket drawn across his lap, standing guard, keeping watch, protecting her even now. Dawn came cold and clear, painting the desert in shades of pearl and rose. Clara woke to the smell of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute most people drank, and the sound of Ethan moving efficiently through his morning routine. "How's the leg?" he asked without turning from the stove. Clara took careful inventory. Pain, yes, but not the screaming agony of yesterday. More of a deep, throbbing ache that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. "Better," she said, surprised by the truth of it. "That's the body's natural response to trauma. Don't mistake it for healing. You've got weeks of pain ahead of you still." He poured coffee into a tin cup, brought it to her. "Drink this. I need to check the splint before I ride to the ranch." The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, bitter and black. Clara sipped it carefully, watching as Ethan knelt beside the bed and began unwrapping the bandages around her leg. His touch was as gentle as it had been last night, his focus absolute. "Swelling's gone down," he observed. "That's good. Means the bone's aligned properly, blood's flowing like it should." He rewrapped the splint with fresh bandages, his movements deft and sure. "You'll have a scar. Might have a slight limp even after it heals properly. But you'll walk again." "Will I ride?" The question surprised them both. Clara hadn't realized it mattered until she heard herself ask. Ethan sat back on his heels, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Eventually, if you're patient, if you let it heal completely before you try, if you don't rush it because some society doctor tells you you're fine when you're not." "How do you know so much about injuries?" "Spent 10 years working ranches from Montana to Mexico. Seen every kind of accident a man can have with livestock, horses, and bad luck." He stood, moving back to pour himself coffee. "Learned early that doctors don't ride out for men like me. You learn to fix yourself, or you don't make it." The casual statement revealed more than he probably intended. Clara thought of her own life, of summers spent in San Francisco while her father conducted business, of winters in the ranch house with its imported furniture and servants who appeared at the ring of a bell. She'd never gone a day without medical care available at her family's discretion. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For what?" "For everything. For the way the world works." Ethan's laugh was short and without humor. "World works the way people make it work, Miss Whitmore. Apologizing for it doesn't change anything." He set down his cup, reaching for his hat, battered felt, worn smooth by weather and time. "I'll be back before noon with your family. Probably should warn you, when they get here things are going to get complicated." "I can handle complicated." "Can you?" He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Woman who rides out alone, ignores her father's warnings, values an afternoon of freedom over her own safety? Maybe you can. Or maybe you just think you can because you've never had to handle consequences that matter. The words stung because they contained truth Clara didn't want to acknowledge. How many times had she pushed boundaries, knowing her father's wealth and influence would smooth over any trouble she created? How many times had she relied on her name to shield her from real consequences? "You don't know anything about me," she said, hearing the defensive edge in her own voice. "Know enough. Know you're engaged to a man you don't love, planning a wedding you don't want, living a life that fits you about as well as those fancy riding boots fit this desert." He settled his hat low over his eyes. "But that's your business, not mine. I'll deliver you back to your family, they'll see you get proper medical care, and that'll be the end of it. And if I want to thank you properly, pay you for your help?" His jaw tightened. "Don't need your money, Miss Whitmore. Don't want it either." "Then what do you want?" The question hung in the air between them, charged with something Clara couldn't name. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw something complicated. Frustration, maybe, or resignation, or something deeper that her sheltered life had given her no context to understand. I want you to think about what happens when the story of last night spreads, he said finally. Think about how people will look at you, how they'll whisper, how they'll judge. And when you're sitting in your father's house, safe and comfortable, surrounded by people who believe the worst of me without question, I want you to remember that I asked for nothing, expected nothing, and got exactly what I expected. He turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. The sound of his horse's hoofbeats faded into the morning silence, leaving Clara alone in the spare cabin with nothing but her thoughts, and the throbbing ache in her leg, and the growing certainty that Ethan Redhawk was wrong about one thing. This wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. The sun climbed higher, filling the cabin with harsh light that showed every worn surface, every rough edge, every sign of a life lived without luxury or comfort. Clara studied the space with new eyes, seeing past the poverty to the intention behind it, the way everything had its place, the cleanliness despite the lack of amenities, the care evident in small details like the neatly stacked firewood and the swept floor. This was a man who took pride in what little he had, who maintained order in a world that had given him nothing but scraps. Shame curled in Clara's stomach as she thought of her own room at the ranch house, twice the size of this entire cabin, filled with furniture she barely noticed, clothes she wore once and forgot, luxuries she took for granted like breathing. She tried to stand, thinking she could at least make the bed, do something to repay Ethan's kindness in some small way. The moment her injured leg touched the floor, pain exploded through her with such force that she collapsed back onto the mattress, gasping. "Stupid," she muttered, angry at her own weakness. "Stupid and useless." The door opened. Clara's head snapped up, expecting Ethan, but the figure in the doorway was older, rounder, wrapped in a shawl despite the warming day. The woman's face was weathered like old leather, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. "So," she said, her accent thick and musical, "you're the Whitmore girl who's got my nephew in trouble before he even did anything wrong." "Your nephew? You mean Ethan?" "Only nephew I've got." The woman moved into the cabin with surprising speed, closing the door behind her. "I'm Sarah Redfeather. Came to check on you before the whole town descends like locusts. Let me see that leg." Clara started to object, then caught the look in Sarah's eyes, the same uncompromising steadiness she'd seen in Ethan's. This was a woman who expected to be obeyed, and who had earned that expectation through hard experience. Sarah unwrapped the bandages with practiced efficiency, her fingers probing the injury with surprising gentleness. She made small sounds as she worked, clicks of her tongue, soft grunts that might have been approval or concern. "He did good work," she said finally, rewrapping the splint. "Bones set clean, swellings minimal. You'll heal straight if you're smart about it." "Ethan said 6 weeks before I can walk." "Ethan's being optimistic. 8 weeks more likely, and that's only if you follow orders, which I'm guessing you're not used to doing." The assessment was so accurate that Clara couldn't even be offended. "He went to tell my family where I am." "I know. Saw him riding toward the Whitmore ranch like he was heading for his own hanging." Sarah settled into one of the chairs, fixing Clara with that sharp gaze. "Which, in a way, he is. You understand that, don't you? What your being here means? He saved my life. Anyone with sense will see that." "Sense." Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Child, do you think people care about sense when they've got a chance to believe the worst? Your family's got power, got money, got influence. My nephew's got nothing but the clothes on his back and a name that makes people nervous. Who do you think they're going to believe when stories start spreading? The truth. The truth is you're a white woman, rich and engaged, who spent the night alone with a native man in his cabin. The truth is your reputation's already ruined just by being here, and the only question is whether they'll blame you for being careless or him for taking advantage." Clara's hands clenched in the rough blanket. "That's not fair. Been telling you, fair's got nothing to do with it." Sarah leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "I'm not saying this to scare you, girl. I'm saying it so you understand what's coming. So you're prepared when your mother starts crying about scandal, and your father starts talking about protecting the family name, and your fiancé starts making demands about proving your virtue." The scenario Sarah painted was so vivid, so accurate to everything Clara knew about her family's priorities, that nausea rolled through her stomach. "What should I do?" she whispered. That depends. You planning to stand by what you said? That Ethan saved your life, treated you with respect, did nothing wrong? Of course. Even when it costs you? Even when your mother threatens to disown you? Even when Morrison's son calls off the wedding and every society matron in 3 states starts whispering about you being damaged goods? The questions hit like physical blows. Clara thought of her life, of the carefully constructed future that had seemed so inevitable just yesterday. Married to William Morrison III, installed in a mansion in San Francisco, hosting parties and attending charity functions and living the exact life her mother had trained her for since birth. A life that had felt like a noose tightening around her neck. I won't lie, Clara said firmly. I won't let them turn Ethan into a villain for being a good man. Sarah studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right then. But understand this. Standing up for him means standing against your whole world, means choosing truth over comfort. And once you make that choice, you can't unmake it. The society women who shun you won't suddenly forgive you. The family members who cut you off won't take you back. You'll be marked, girl, forever. Then I'll be marked. The words came out stronger than Clara felt, but once spoken, she recognized them as true. Whatever came next, whatever price she had to pay for one night in this bare cabin, with a man who'd asked nothing and given everything, she would pay it. Because the alternative was worse than any scandal. The alternative was becoming the kind of person who let an innocent man suffer to protect her own comfort. Sarah rose, moving to the stove where she began making fresh coffee. You got more spine than I expected, Miss Whitmore. We'll see if it holds when the real test comes. When will that be? Soon enough. Sarah glanced toward the window, her expression tightening. Because unless I miss my guess, that's your family coming now. And they don't look happy. Clara heard it then. The sound of multiple horses, moving fast. The thunder of hoofbeats grew louder, closer, until it seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. Then silence as the riders pulled up short, followed by the chaos of voices, men calling to each other, boots hitting the ground. The door burst open without warning. James Whitmore filled the doorway, his face flushed with exertion and fury. Behind him crowded 3 ranch hands, all armed, all watching Ethan with the kind of suspicion that could turn to violence at the slightest provocation. Clara! Her father's voice cracked like a whip. Thank God! When this man said you'd fallen... His gaze swept the cabin, taking in the single room, the bed where Clara lay, the sparse furnishings. Something dark crossed his expression. What happened here? Mr. Redhawk saved my life, Clara said clearly. My horse threw me. I broke my leg badly. He found me, set the bone, brought me here because I couldn't make it back to the ranch. He's done nothing but help me. Her father's attention shifted to Ethan, who stood slightly apart from the group, his expression carefully blank. That true? I found Miss Whitmore about 2 hours before sunset yesterday, Ethan said, his voice level. Compound fracture of the left tibia. Reduced the bone, splinted the leg, provided shelter. That's all. That's all. James Whitmore's voice was soft, dangerous. You kept my daughter in your cabin overnight, alone, unchaperoned. And you expect me to believe nothing happened? Believe what you want. I'm telling you what occurred. Father, Clara struggled to sit up straighter, ignoring the pain that lanced through her leg. Listen to me. He was a perfect gentleman. He slept in a chair. He gave me his bed, his blanket, his food. Without him, I'd be dead. Or you'd be safely back at the ranch if he'd done the decent thing and brought you straight home instead of keeping you here like someone with a broken leg who'd die if she was moved 6 miles over rough country in the dark. Sarah Redfeather's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She stepped forward, positioning herself between Ethan and the ranch hands. You want to be angry at someone, James Whitmore. Be angry at yourself for letting your daughter ride out alone. Be angry at whatever spooked her horse. But don't you dare blame my nephew for having more sense than to kill your child out of concern for her precious reputation. Whitmore's face went purple. You presume to lecture me about my own daughter? I presume to tell you the truth, which is more than most people in this valley will do because you've got money and they want to keep breathing. Sarah's eyes flashed. That girl's alive because Ethan has skills most of your fancy doctors don't. She'll walk again because he knew how to set a bone proper instead of fumbling around and making it worse. And if you had an ounce of gratitude in that proud body of yours, you'd thank him instead of looking for excuses to call him a criminal. The silence that followed was absolute. One of the ranch hands, young, barely 20, with fear and excitement warring in his expression, shifted his weight, hand drifting toward his gun belt. "Mr. Whitmore, you want us to— No?" Clara's voice rang out, stronger than she knew she could make it. "Nobody's doing anything, Father. I'm telling you exactly what happened, the truth. If you don't believe me, if you think I'm lying or confused or compromised somehow, then you don't know your own daughter at all." Father and daughter locked eyes across the cabin. Clara saw the war in his expression, fury and fear and wounded pride all tangling together. But beneath it, she saw something else. Recognition. The acknowledgement that his daughter, his sheltered, obedient daughter, had become someone capable of standing her ground. "Get her things," Whitmore said finally, jerking his chin at the ranch hands. "We're taking her to Doc Matthews." "There aren't any things," Clara said. "I fell off my horse, remember? I don't have anything except what I'm wearing." "Then we'll carry you as you are." Her father moved toward the bed, clearly intending to lift her himself. "Mr. Whitmore." Ethan's quiet voice stopped him. "She needs to be moved carefully. The bone's only been set for a few hours. If it shifts wrong during transport, she could end up with permanent damage, crooked leg, constant pain. Maybe she never walks right again." "And you're an expert on this?" "I've set enough bones to know what I'm talking about. Your choice whether you listen." The challenge in those words was subtle but unmistakable. James Whitmore wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by men he considered beneath his station. His hands clenched into fists. "Fine," he ground out. "Tell me how to move her without causing damage." What followed was a tense, careful operation. Ethan directed the ranch hands in constructing a makeshift stretcher from saddle blankets and long poles. He showed them how to lift Clara without jarring her leg, how to secure the splint for travel, how to position her body to minimize stress on the injury. Through it all, her father watched with the expression of a man swallowing something bitter. They carried Clara out into the bright morning, laying the stretcher across the back of a wagon one of the hands had brought. The movement still hurt, still sent waves of nausea through her stomach, but Ethan's preparations made it bearable. As they secured her for the journey, Clara looked back at the cabin. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face unreadable. Ethan was already walking toward his horse, clearly planning to ride away now that his responsibility was discharged. "Wait," Clara called. "Mr. Redhawk, Ethan, thank you for everything." He paused, half-turned, his expression carefully neutral. "Hope your leg heals clean, Miss Whitmore." The formal distance in his voice hurt more than Clara wanted to admit. She wanted to say more, to bridge the gulf that had opened between them in the presence of her family, to make him understand that she meant what she'd said about defending him. But her father was already climbing onto the wagon seat, and the ranch hands were mounting up, and the moment slipped away like water through her fingers. As the wagon lurched into motion, carrying her away from the bare cabin and the quiet man who'd saved her life, Clara twisted to look back one last time. Ethan stood perfectly still, watching her go, his face revealing nothing. But in the space between them, in the morning light flooding across the desert, Clara felt something shift. A connection forged in pain and survival and unexpected kindness, fragile as spider silk, strong as steel cable. The world thought they knew how this story ended. They were wrong. The journey back to the Whitmore ranch passed in a haze of pain and suppressed fury. Every rut in the road sent jolts through Clara's leg despite the careful padding, but she bit down on the leather strap one of the ranch hands had given her and refused to cry out. Her father sat rigid on the wagon seat, his silence more terrible than any shouting could have been. They didn't speak until the wagon rolled through the gates of the ranch compound, past the white-painted fences and manicured gardens that suddenly seemed obscene in their perfection. The main house rose before them, 3 stories of imported stone and hand-carved trim, a monument to wealth that Clara had never truly seen until she'd spent a night in a one-room cabin with a dirt floor. Her mother burst through the front doors before the wagon had fully stopped. her silk morning dress fluttering around her ankles, her face pale with what might have been genuine fear or practiced dramatics. Clara could no longer tell the difference. "My baby!" Margaret Whitmore cried, rushing to the wagon. "Oh, my darling girl, what has that savage done to you?" "Mother, stop!" Clara's voice came out harder than she'd intended. "Mr. Red Hawk saved my life. He did nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong? You spent the entire night in his cabin, alone. Do you have any idea what people will say?" "I have a broken leg, Mother. I nearly died. What people say is the least of my concerns." Margaret's hand flew to her chest as though Clara had physically struck her. "The least of your— Clara Margaret Whitmore, your reputation is everything. Your engagement, your future, your entire life depends on— On lies?" Clara interrupted. "On pretending something terrible happened when it didn't? On destroying a good man's name to protect appearances?" "Good man?" Her mother's voice went shrill. "That half-breed has compromised you beyond— Margaret!" James Whitmore's voice cracked like a gunshot. "Get Doc Matthews, now!" For once, Margaret Whitmore obeyed without argument, gathering her skirts and hurrying back into the house. Clara's father climbed down from the wagon, his movements stiff with barely controlled rage. When he looked at his daughter, his eyes held something Clara had never seen before: disappointment. "I raised you to be smarter than this," he said quietly. "Smart enough to survive when my horse threw me? Smart enough to accept help when I had no other choice?" Clara met his gaze steadily. "Or smart enough to lie about what happened to protect our family's precious reputation? Smart enough to understand consequences?" He gestured to the ranch hands. "Carefully now. Take her to her room." They lifted the stretcher with practiced ease, carrying Clara through doors she'd passed through 1,000 times, but which now seemed to belong to a stranger's house. The entry hall with its crystal chandelier, the sweeping staircase with its polished banister, the portraits of 3 generations of Whitmores staring down from the walls. All of it felt foreign, excessive, wrong. Her bedroom occupied the entire east wing of the 2nd floor. Windows overlooked the gardens, the pastures beyond, the distant mountains that marked the edge of Whitmore land. The bed, a 4-poster monstrosity imported from France, could have slept 6 people comfortably. The wardrobe held more dresses than Clara could wear in a year. The ranch hands laid her on the bed as gently as they could, then retreated quickly, clearly uncomfortable being in the private chambers of the boss's daughter. Her father remained standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. "Doc Matthews will be here within the hour," he said without turning. "He'll examine you, reset the bone if necessary, provide proper medical care." "The bone is already set properly. Ethan knew what he was doing." "Ethan," her father's voice went cold. "You're on familiar terms with him now?" "He saved my life. I think that earns him the right to be called by his given name." James Whitmore finally turned to face her. His expression was carefully controlled, but Clara saw the fury simmering beneath the surface, and beneath that something worse: fear. "Let me explain something to you, daughter," he said quietly. "In about 3 hours, every person in this valley is going to know that you spent the night in Ethan Red Hawk's cabin. They're going to draw their own conclusions about what that means, and those conclusions won't be kind, to you or to him. Then I'll tell them the truth." "The truth?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The truth is, you were alone with a man who isn't your fiancé. The truth is, you came back wearing the same clothes, with no witnesses to verify his story or yours. The truth is that in the eyes of society, you are now ruined goods, unless we control the narrative." Clara's hands clenched in the silk coverlet. "What narrative?" "That you were injured and delirious. That Red Hawk found you but had the decency to bring you straight home to proper care. That nothing inappropriate occurred because you were unconscious the entire time. That's a lie. It's a story that protects both of you." Her father moved closer to the bed, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he used when closing business deals. "Think about it, Clara. If we say you were conscious, people will ask why you stayed, why you didn't demand to be brought home immediately, why you accepted shelter from a man you barely know. The questions alone will destroy your reputation. And Ethan's? Red Hawk's reputation is already suspect. He survived this long by keeping his head down and avoiding trouble. This situation brings him nothing but problems, regardless of what actually happened. Clara stared at her father, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time in her life. The calculation in his eyes, the way he weighed outcomes like a shopkeeper weighing grain, everything measured against profit and loss, reputation and influence. "You want me to lie," she said slowly, "to say I don't remember anything, to let people believe I was helpless and unconscious while Ethan did nothing but deliver me like a package. I want you to be smart. You want me to be obedient. I want you to survive this." The words burst from him with sudden violence. "You have no idea what you're playing with here. William Morrison will call off the engagement if there's even a hint of scandal. Senator Morrison will make sure every door in San Francisco closes to you. Your mother will be ostracized from every social circle that matters. And Red Hawk, if people think for 1 second that he touched you inappropriately, there are men in this town who will—" He stopped abruptly, but the unfinished sentence hung between them like smoke. "Who will what?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. "Who will take justice into their own hands?" Her father's voice had gone flat. "This is the frontier, Clara. The law isn't always as strong as people's prejudices. If the story gets out of control, if people believe the wrong things, Red Hawk could end up dead. Is that what you want? To be responsible for a man's death because you insisted on telling your version of the truth?" The question struck Clara like a physical blow. She thought of Ethan standing in the morning light, watching her wagon pull away, his face carefully blank. She thought of the quiet competence with which he'd saved her life, asking nothing, expecting nothing. Could her truth kill him? "That's what I thought," her father said, misreading her silence. "You're a good girl, Clara. You always have been. Just tell Doc Matthews you don't remember anything after the fall. Say you were unconscious, in and out of awareness. Let the adults handle the rest." "The adults," Clara repeated bitterly. "You mean the people who care more about reputation than reality?" "I mean the people who understand how the world actually works." He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "Think about what I said. Think about what's at stake, for all of you. And then make the smart choice." He left, closing the door behind him with a soft click that felt like the closing of a trap. Clara lay alone in her luxurious prison, staring up at the canopy overhead, her father's words echoing in her mind. Make the smart choice. Protect yourself. Let the lie protect everyone. Except lies didn't protect. They corrupted. They festered. They became the truth through repetition until nobody remembered what had actually happened. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. The door opened before she could respond, admitting her mother with Doc Matthews in tow, a portly man in his 60s who'd been attending the Whitmore family since before Clara was born. "My poor dear," he murmured, setting his medical bag on the bedside table. "Let's have a look at this leg, shall we?" Margaret hovered nearby, wringing her hands while Doc Matthews cut away the bandages Ethan had so carefully applied. When he exposed the injury, his eyebrows rose. "Well," he said, surprise evident in his voice, "this is remarkably well set. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. The bones perfectly aligned. The splint is professionally applied. I couldn't have done better myself." "That's impossible," Margaret said sharply. "That savage had no medical training." "Savage or not, he's got skilled hands." Doc Matthews probed the injury gently, watching Clara's face for signs of pain. "How much did he give you for the pain? Whiskey, laudanum?" "Whiskey," Clara said, "before he reset the bone." "Smart. Laudanum would have made you too relaxed, needed the muscles tense for proper alignment." He began rewrapping the splint, his movements practiced but somehow less confident than Ethan's had been. "You're lucky he found you, Miss Clara. Another hour or two out there, and the shock alone might have killed you." "I know," Clara said quietly. "I owe him my life." Margaret made a small sound of distress. Doc Matthews glanced at her, then back at Clara, something knowing in his expression. "I expect you'll want to send him some payment," he said carefully. "Token of gratitude from the family. Proper thing to do." "Money isn't what he needs," Clara said. "He needs people to stop treating him like a criminal for doing the right thing." The room fell silent. Doc Matthews finished securing the bandage, then sat back with a heavy sigh. "Miss Clara," he said gently, I've been practicing medicine in this valley for 30 years. I've seen good men destroyed by rumors, and I've seen guilty men walk free because they had the right name. What I learned is that the truth matters less than people want to believe it does. Are you telling me to lie? I'm telling you to be careful. Red Hawk's in a dangerous position right now. The best thing you can do for him is exactly what your father suggested. Say you don't remember much. Take the focus off what happened in that cabin and put it on your injury, your recovery. Let people forget about him. I won't forget about him. I didn't say forget. I said let other people forget. There's a difference. He closed his medical bag with a decisive snap. You've got 8 weeks minimum before that leg's healed enough to walk on. Use that time wisely. Figure out what you really want and what you're willing to lose to get it. After he left, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers pleating the coverlet nervously. "Darling," she began, "I know you think we're being cruel, but we're trying to protect you. The Morrison wedding is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. If William calls it off because of this scandal, maybe that would be for the best." Her mother's face went white. "You can't mean that." "Can't I? When was the last time William and I had a real conversation, Mother? When did he last ask me what I thought about anything that mattered? We barely know each other." That's how these arrangements work. Love comes later, after marriage. After what? After I've learned to be grateful for whatever scraps of affection he throws my way? Clara struggled to sit up straighter, ignoring the pain the movement caused. I've been to enough society dinners to see how those marriages end. The wives smile and host parties and pretend not to notice when their husbands keep mistresses in the city. Is that the future you want for me? I want you to be secure, protected. A woman without a good marriage has nothing in this world. A woman with a loveless marriage has even less. Margaret stood abruptly, her composure fracturing. "You're talking nonsense. The injury has you confused, emotional. When you've had time to rest, to think clearly, I am thinking clearly. For the first time in years, I'm seeing things exactly as they are. Then what you're seeing is the delusion of a foolish girl who thinks one night of adventure somehow changed who she is." Margaret's voice turned sharp. "You are Clara Whitmore. You were raised for a certain life, given every advantage, prepared for a position that hundreds of girls would kill for. And you're going to throw it all away because some frontier drifter set your broken leg? His name is Ethan Red Hawk, and he's a better man than anyone I've met in all those society ballrooms you're so proud of." The slap came so fast Clara didn't see it coming. Her head snapped to the side, her cheek blazing with sudden heat. Margaret stood frozen, her hand still raised, shock and horror warring on her face. "Clara, Get out. I didn't mean to get out of my room. Now." Margaret fled, her skirts rustling against the doorframe. The door closed, and Clara was alone again with nothing but the throbbing in her cheek and the deeper ache in her chest. She raised her hand to her face, touching the hot skin gently. Her mother had never struck her before, never lost control like that. The shock of it settled over Clara like ice water, clarifying everything. This was what happened when you challenged the order of things, when you refused to play the role assigned to you, when you chose truth over comfort. They would hurt you to make you comply. Night fell over the ranch, and with it came the sound of voices from the dining room below. Her father's deep rumble, her mother's higher pitch, and a third voice Clara recognized with sinking dread. William Morrison III had arrived. She heard footsteps on the stairs, the murmur of conversation growing louder as they approached her room. When the knock came, Clara didn't bother to answer. The door opened anyway. William stood in the doorway, immaculate as always in his tailored suit, his blonde hair pomaded into perfect waves. He was handsome in the way expensive things are handsome, polished, refined, utterly without character. "Clara," he said, his tone managing to convey both concern and reproach. "My father and I came as soon as we heard. What a terrible ordeal you've been through." "Hello, William." He entered the room, leaving the door conspicuously open. Propriety must be maintained even now. Taking a chair near the bed, he studied her with pale blue eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Your father explained what happened," he said carefully. "The accident, your injuries, the unfortunate circumstances of your rescue." "Unfortunate how?" "Don't play games with me, Clara. You know exactly what I mean. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. You spent the night alone with a man, an unmarried man, a man of questionable background and dubious character. His character is beyond question. He saved my life. So everyone keeps saying, but that doesn't change the facts of the situation. You were unchaperoned in his dwelling. Your reputation has been compromised. Clara studied her fiancé's face, looking for any sign of real emotion, anger, jealousy, even wounded pride. She found nothing but calculation, the same cold assessment she'd seen in her father's eyes. Are you asking me what happened? She said quietly. Or have you already decided? I'm trying to determine how much damage has been done and whether it can be repaired. William straightened his cuffs, a gesture Clara had seen him make 1,000 times when discussing business. My father is willing to proceed with the wedding as planned, provided certain conditions are met. Conditions. You will state publicly that you were unconscious for most of the ordeal, that your memory of events is confused at best, that while you're grateful for Red Hawk's assistance, nothing inappropriate occurred because you were too injured to be aware of your surroundings. You want me to lie. I want you to be sensible. If you insist on defending this man, on claiming you were fully conscious and aware while staying in his cabin, people will draw their own conclusions. The wedding will be called off. Your reputation will be destroyed. And for what? To protect the honor of a man who has none to protect? The casual cruelty of the statement took Clara's breath away. You don't know anything about him. I know enough. I know he's lived alone in that cabin for 5 years. I know he works odd jobs when he can get them, but most ranchers won't hire him because of his background. I know the townspeople avoid him, and for good reason. His kind can't be trusted around civilized women. His kind. Claire's voice went flat. Say what you really mean, William. Fine. He's a half-breed who lives on the margins of society for a reason. Whatever skills he may have demonstrated in treating your injury, don't change the fundamental fact that allowing him into your life, even temporarily, was a mistake that could cost you everything. Then maybe everything I have isn't worth keeping. William stood abruptly, his careful composure finally cracking. Are you actually considering throwing away our engagement, our future, everything we've planned? Everything you and my parents planned. I don't recall being asked what I wanted. What you wanted? He laughed, but the sound held no warmth. You're 23 years old, Clara. You wanted parties and pretty dresses and horses to ride. The adults around you wanted to secure your future, to ensure you'd be taken care of, to give you a life of comfort and status. And this is how you repay that concern. By mooning over some savage who probably saw you as nothing but an opportunity to… Finish that sentence, Clara said dangerously. I dare you. William's jaw worked as he fought for control. When he spoke again, his voice had regained its measured tone, but his eyes remained cold. I'm going to do you the courtesy of assuming your injury has made you temporarily irrational. I'll return in 3 days. By then, I expect you to have come to your senses and be prepared to issue the statement we discussed. If not, he paused at the door. If not, then you'll learn exactly how quickly society forgets the name of a woman who ruins herself. After he left, Clara lay in the darkness of her room, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Somewhere out there, 2 miles west across the desert, Ethan Red Hawk was probably sitting in his cabin, unaware of the storm gathering around him. Or maybe he was completely aware. Maybe he'd seen this coming from the moment he lifted her from the desert floor. Clara thought about what Doc Matthews had said, about what her father wanted, about William's ultimatum and her mother's tears and the careful web of lies everyone expected her to weave. And she thought about Ethan's hands, gentle and sure on her broken leg, about his voice, calm in the midst of her pain, about the way he'd asked for nothing and given everything and expected the world to condemn him for it. The choice crystallized in her mind with sudden, perfect clarity. She wouldn't lie. She wouldn't protect herself at his expense. And if that meant losing everything, her engagement, her reputation, her place in society, then so be it. Some things mattered more than comfort. Some truths were worth the cost of telling them. The next morning brought visitors. Clara woke to the sound of carriages arriving, of women's voices in the entry hall below. Through her window, she could see a parade of the valley's most prominent society matrons making their way to the house, drawn by scandal like vultures to carrion. Her mother appeared at the door, her face carefully composed. "Mrs. Hendricks and her daughter are here," Margaret said, "along with Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Chen, and several others. They've come to pay their respects." "You mean they've come to gather gossip?" "They've come to show support for our family during this difficult time, and you will receive them graciously, Clara. You will be polite, dignified, and you will not under any circumstances provide them with ammunition to use against us." "Ammunition like the truth?" "Ammunition like details they can twist and spread throughout the valley." Margaret's hands twisted together. "Please, darling, I'm begging you, for your own sake if not ours, be careful what you say." Against her better judgment, Clara agreed to see the visitors. Her mother helped her into a modest day dress and arranged her hair to look artfully disheveled, the picture of a young woman recovering from a terrible ordeal. They came in groups of 2 and 3, filling her room with rustling skirts and barely concealed curiosity. Mrs. Hendricks, the banker's wife, led the charge with her daughter Penelope in tow. "My dear Clara," she gushed, settling into the chair beside the bed. "We were simply devastated to hear about your accident. You poor, poor thing. And to be found by, well, we won't speak of unpleasant things." "Why not?" Clara asked mildly. "Mr. Redhawk saved my life. That seems like a pleasant thing to discuss." The room went silent. Penelope Hendricks' eyes went wide with scandalized delight. Mrs. Patterson, a steel-haired woman who'd been the valley's arbiter of social propriety for 3 decades, leaned forward. "It's true then," she said. "You were conscious, aware, during your time in his cabin." "I was aware that I had a compound fracture and would have died without immediate medical attention, yes." "And he provided this attention personally?" The way Mrs. Patterson said the word made it sound obscene. "He set my broken leg with more skill than I've seen from trained physicians. He gave me shelter and food and asked for nothing in return. If you're implying something inappropriate occurred, Mrs. Patterson, you're wrong." "No one is implying anything," Mrs. Hendricks said quickly, though her eyes betrayed her. "We simply want to understand what happened. For your own protection, dear, you know how people talk." "I know that people will believe what they want to believe regardless of the truth," Clara said. "But since you've asked, here is exactly what happened." And she told them. All of it. The fall, the pain, Ethan's arrival, the careful treatment of her injury, the whiskey to dull the agony, the night spent in his cabin while he kept watch from a chair. She left out nothing, added nothing, spoke with a clarity that made embellishment impossible. When she finished, the silence was deafening. "Well," Mrs. Chen said finally, her accent making the word crisp, "that is quite a story." "It's not a story, it's what happened." "Of course, dear, of course." Mrs. Hendricks patted Clara's hand with condescending sympathy. "Though you must understand how it sounds. A young woman, alone with a man, overnight. Your fiancé must be terribly upset. William is concerned about appearances rather than reality. There's a difference." "Appearances matter in our world, Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Patterson said sharply. "A woman's reputation is her most valuable asset. Once tarnished, my reputation can survive the truth. The question is whether it can survive the lies everyone seems desperate for me to tell." After they left, retreating in a flutter of shocked whispers, Margaret closed the door and turned on her daughter with fury in her eyes. "What were you thinking? Telling them everything? Defending that man so openly? By tomorrow morning, every person in 3 counties will know exactly what you said. The gossip will be unstoppable." "Good," Clara said. "Let them know the truth. Let them judge me for it if they must. But I won't lie to protect people who care more about appearances than justice." "You foolish, foolish girl. You have no idea what you've done." But Clara did know. She'd drawn a line in the sand, chosen a side in a war she hadn't started, but could no longer avoid. And now she would face the consequences. The consequences arrived 3 days later in the form of a letter delivered by William's personal courier. Clara recognized the expensive stationery, the precise handwriting, the cold formality of the language. "Miss Whitmore, after careful consideration of recent events and the statements you have made to various members of our community, I find myself unable to proceed with our planned union. Your behavior has demonstrated a lack of judgment and discretion that makes you unsuitable as a wife to a man in my position. Our engagement is therefore dissolved, effective immediately. I trust you will have the dignity to accept this decision without public protest or further scandal. The ring should be returned to my father's office at your earliest convenience. Regards, William Morrison III. Clara read the letter 3 times, waiting for the pain to hit, for the devastation, the humiliation, the crushing weight of a future destroyed. Instead, she felt nothing but a lightness in her chest, as though invisible chains had fallen away. She was free. The ring, an ostentatious diamond that had always felt too heavy on her finger, came off easily. Clara set it on her nightstand, watching it catch the afternoon light, and felt no regret at all. When her mother discovered the letter that evening, her wail of despair echoed through the house. "Ruined," Margaret sobbed, collapsing into a chair. "My daughter, ruined. Everything we worked for, everything we built, destroyed because you couldn't keep your mouth shut about that savage." "His name," Clara said quietly, "is Ethan Redhawk. And I'm not ruined, Mother. I'm liberated." "Liberated?" Her father's voice cut through Margaret's weeping like a knife. He stood in the doorway, the letter crushed in his fist. "You call this liberation? Being cast off like damaged goods? Becoming the subject of every piece of vicious gossip in the territory? I call it honesty, something this family could use more of." James Whitmore crossed the room in 3 strides, looming over her bed with barely contained fury. "You self-righteous little fool! Do you think your honesty helps anyone? Morrison's calling in favors, spreading stories about your questionable virtue. By the time he's done, no respectable man within 500 miles will consider courting you. You'll be unmarriageable, an old maid before you're 25. Then I'll be an unmarried woman who didn't sacrifice her integrity for the sake of a loveless marriage. Integrity." He spat the word like a curse. "Let's see how much your integrity matters when you're 40 years old and alone, dependent on charity, with no prospects and no future. I'd rather have that future than the one you and William planned for me." Her father's hand rose, and for a terrible moment Clara thought he might strike her as her mother had. Instead, he slammed his fist into the wall beside her bed, leaving a dent in the expensive wallpaper. "You want to know what happens now?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'll tell you, Redhawk becomes a target. Every ranch in this valley will refuse him work. Every business will turn him away. The good people of this community will make sure he pays for the trouble he's caused." "He didn't cause any trouble. I did, by refusing to lie. Same difference. His presence in your life created this situation, and people, good, decent people, will make sure he regrets it." The threat hung in the air between them, poisonous and real. Clara's hands clenched in the coverlet. "If anyone hurts him because of this—" "You'll what? You can't even walk. You're trapped in this bed for weeks, helpless, dependent on the family you've just humiliated." Her father straightened, his face a mask of cold fury. "Think about that while you're lying here. Think about how your integrity might cost that man everything." He left, taking her mother with him, leaving Clara alone with the terrible weight of understanding. Her truth might save her soul, but it could destroy Ethan's life. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. Confined to her bed, unable to walk, Clara could only listen as the household staff whispered in the hallways, as visitors stopped coming entirely, as the invitations that once flooded the house dried up to nothing. She was being erased from society, one withdrawn invitation at a time. Worse were the reports that filtered up from town. Sarah Redfeather came once, her face grim, to tell Clara that Ethan had been turned away from 3 ranches looking for seasonal help, that the general store had refused to extend him credit, that someone had thrown stones through his cabin window in the night. "He says it's not your fault," Sarah told her, standing by the bed with her shawl pulled tight. "Says you did right by telling the truth. But truth don't fill an empty stomach, Miss Whitmore, and it don't stop men with torches and bad intentions." "What can I do?" Clara asked desperately. "I can't even leave this bed." "You can stop defending him so publicly. Let people forget. Give this whole mess time to blow over." "That's what everyone keeps telling me. Let it blow over. Let people forget. Let Ethan become invisible again." Clara shook her head fiercely. "But that's not justice. That's just another kind of lie." "Maybe so. But sometimes survival matters more than justice. Sarah moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the frame. Storm's coming, girl. Real storm, not just gossip and hurt feelings. When it hits, you'll have to choose what matters more, your principles or his life. After she left, Clara lay staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the impossible choice. Stand by the truth and watch Ethan suffer for it, or recant her story and save him at the cost of her integrity. Neither option felt like victory. The storm Sarah predicted arrived 6 days after William's letter, carried on winds that rattled the windows and turned the sky the color of old bruises. But the real storm wasn't weather. It was the rising river, swollen by unseasonable rain in the mountains, threatening to overflow its banks and flood the valley floor, including the Whitmore Ranch. Clara heard the commotion from her bedroom, shouting, running footsteps, her father's voice bellowing orders. When no one came to explain, she dragged herself to the window, using the furniture for support, her injured leg screaming in protest. What she saw made her blood run cold. The river, normally a placid ribbon of water cutting through the valley, had transformed into a raging monster. Brown water churned and boiled, carrying debris, trees, fence posts, what looked like pieces of buildings. The ranch hands were frantically building sandbag barriers, but even from this distance, Clara could see they were fighting a losing battle. The water was rising too fast. And in the midst of the chaos, directing the workers with calm authority, stood Ethan Redhawk. Clara pressed her face against the window glass, her breath fogging the pain as she watched Ethan move among the panicking ranch hands. He gestured toward the weakest point in the hastily constructed barrier, his voice carrying across the yard in sharp, clear commands that cut through the rising wind. Men who'd refused to work alongside him a week ago now turned to him with desperate faces, looking for direction as the water crept higher. Her father stood on the porch, his own authority crumbling as the situation spiraled beyond his control. Clara saw him shout something at Ethan, saw Ethan respond with a curt shake of his head and turn back to the sandbag line. Whatever James Whitmore had said, Ethan had dismissed it as irrelevant in the face of immediate danger. Clara grabbed the bedpost, pulling herself upright despite the white-hot pain that shot through her leg. The splint Ethan had so carefully applied held firm, but her muscles had weakened from days of bed rest. Her first step sent her crashing to the floor, the impact jarring her broken bone with such force that darkness spotted her vision. "Miss Clara!" The housemaid, Jenny, rushed in from the hallway. "What are you doing out of bed? The doctor said—" "Help me up," Clara gasped, gripping the girl's arm. "I need to get downstairs." "You can't walk. Your leg—" "Then help me crawl if you have to, but I'm getting down there." Jenny stared at her for a long moment, then her face hardened with decision. She was barely 18, farm-raised before coming to work at the ranch, and she understood crisis in a way the other household staff didn't. "Put your arm around my shoulders," she said. "We'll take it slow." The journey down the stairs was agony. Each step sent shockwaves through Clara's injured leg, but she bit down on her lip until she tasted blood and kept moving. By the time they reached the ground floor, sweat soaked through her dress, and her vision swam with pain. Through the open front door, Clara could see the full scope of the disaster. The river had breached its banks completely now, water spreading across the lower pastures like a living thing, consuming everything in its path. The main house sat on higher ground, but the stables, the equipment sheds, the workers' quarters, all of it lay in the flood's direct path, and the water was still rising. "No, no, no! You're doing it wrong!" Ethan's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. He grabbed a ranch hand by the shoulder, physically turning him. "Sandbags perpendicular to the flow, not parallel. You want to redirect the water, not just block it. It'll find the gaps and tear everything apart." "Who put you in charge?" one of the men shouted back. "We don't take orders from someone who knows what he's doing." Ethan's eyes were hard as flint. "Because right now, that seems to be me and nobody else. So you can swallow your pride and listen, or you can watch everything you've built wash away. Your choice. Make it fast." The man's face flushed red, but he turned back to the sandbags and adjusted his position. James Whitmore descended from the porch, his face dark with fury and something that might have been fear. "Redhawk, I want you off my property. Now." "Your property's about to be underwater, Mr. Whitmore. Might want to focus on that instead of whatever grudge you're nursing." "I don't need your help. I don't want your help. You've caused enough damage to my family." Ethan straightened, water already soaking through his boots as the flood crept closer, When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet intensity that made several of the ranch hands stop working to listen. I came here because your foreman rode to my cabin this morning begging for help. Said the river was rising faster than anything he'd seen in 20 years. Said you had 40 head of cattle trapped in the lower pasture and not enough men who knew how to build a proper flood barrier. So I came, not because I give a damn about your opinion of me, but because leaving animals to drown isn't something I can stomach. He gestured toward the stables. You want me gone? Fine. But first tell me who else here knows how to reinforce a foundation against floodwater. Who else has worked the Missouri breaks during spring floods? Who else has seen what water this angry can do when it gets underneath a building? The silence was answer enough. James Whitmore's jaw worked as he ground his teeth, pride and necessity warring across his face. Finally, through what looked like physical pain, he forced out the words. Tell me what needs to be done. Clara watched from the doorway as Ethan transformed the chaos into coordinated action. He divided the men into teams, one to evacuate the animals, another to shore up the stable foundation, a third to build a secondary barrier between the river and the main house. His instructions were precise, delivered without hesitation, and the men followed them with an efficiency born of desperation. We need timber, Ethan called to James. Long beams, heavy as you can get. Going to build a brace system for the stable walls before the water undermines the foundation. The lumber shed is already flooding. I saw it on my way in. You've got maybe an hour before the whole structure collapses. Then where? The old barn, north side of the property. It's been abandoned for years, but the frame's solid oak. We can salvage enough to do the job. James stared at him. That barn's 2 miles from here. There's no time. There's time if we move now. You have a wagon and team that can make the trip? The Clydesdales. But in this weather, can they do it or not? Something shifted in James Whitmore's expression, the first crack in the wall of prejudice and pride he'd built around his judgment of Ethan. They can do it. Then get them harnessed. I'll take 3 men and bring back as much timber as we can carry. But I need you to keep this barrier stable while I'm gone. Can you do that? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. James Whitmore, who'd spent the past week working to destroy Ethan's reputation and livelihood, was being asked to trust him with the salvation of everything he'd built. I can do it, James said finally. Ethan nodded once, then turned to survey the assembled workers. His eyes found Clara in the doorway, and for a moment their gazes locked across the churning water and driving rain. She saw recognition there, and something that might have been concern, before he looked away and began selecting men for the timber run. Clara hobbled forward, using the doorframe for support, and her father's head snapped around. What are you doing out of bed? He demanded, watching people work together instead of tearing each other apart. It's refreshing. This isn't the time for your commentary, Clara. Get back inside before you hurt yourself further. I'm already hurt, Father. The question is whether you're going to let your pride hurt everyone else. She didn't wait for his response, turning instead to watch as Ethan climbed onto the wagon seat. The Clydesdales stamped nervously, their massive hooves churning mud, but they settled under his hands with surprising speed. He clicked his tongue, and the wagon lurched forward, heading toward the north road at a pace that seemed reckless given the conditions. The men he'd left behind worked with renewed focus, their earlier resistance dissolved in the face of imminent disaster. Clara saw her father move among them, his commands now echoing Ethan's instructions, implementing the plan that had been laid out with such precision. For the first time in her life, she saw her father follow another man's lead. The wait for Ethan's return was excruciating. The water continued to rise, inch by terrible inch, until it lapped at the base of the sandbag barrier. The stable foundation groaned audibly, the old timbers protesting the unprecedented stress. One of the ranch hands, a boy barely 16, started to panic, his movements becoming frantic and uncoordinated. Steady, James said, gripping the boy's shoulder. Panic kills faster than water. You do your job, trust the barrier, and we'll get through this. The boy nodded, visibly forcing himself to slow down, to focus. Clara recognized the words as an echo of something Ethan must have said earlier, the calm authority of a man who'd seen disaster and survived it. 30 minutes passed. 40. The rain intensified, turning the world into a gray curtain that made visibility almost impossible. Clara clung to the porch railing, searching the northern road for any sign of the wagon. "They're not coming back," one of the workers muttered. "Probably got swept away on that old road. It floods first in heavy rain." "They're coming back," Clara said with a certainty she didn't entirely feel. "Ethan knows what he's doing." "You put a lot of faith in a man you barely know, Miss Whitmore." "I put faith in a man who's proven himself when it mattered. That's more than I can say for most of the people in this valley." The worker's face reddened, but before he could respond, someone shouted from the road, "There! I see them!" The wagon emerged from the rain like a ghost ship, timber stacked so high it seemed impossible the Clydesdales could pull it. Ethan stood on the driver's seat, reins wrapped around his forearms, his whole body leaning into the effort of controlling the massive horses on the treacherous road. They'd brought back enough oak to build a small house. "How did you—" James started, but Ethan was already jumping down, calling out instructions before his boots hit the mud. "Tom, Jake, get that timber unloaded and sorted by length. Matthews, you and your crew start building the support frames. We need them in place before the water reaches the stable walls. Mr. Whitmore, I need you to check the foundation on the east side. If there's any erosion starting, we need to know now." The next hour was a blur of coordinated chaos. Ethan moved among the workers like a conductor leading an orchestra, his presence somehow making the impossible seem achievable. He worked harder than any two men combined, hauling timber, driving support beams into the waterlogged ground with a sledgehammer, shoring up weak points in the barrier with sandbags and sheer determination. Clara watched him lift a beam that should have required 3 men to move, muscles straining under his soaked shirt, and felt something shift in her chest. This was a man the town had dismissed as worthless, as dangerous, as less than human, but here, in the midst of crisis, he was the only thing standing between her family and complete ruin. "The East Foundation's compromised," James called out, sloshing through knee-deep water. "There's erosion starting under the main support post." Ethan's jaw tightened. "How bad?" "Bad enough. The whole wall could collapse if the water rises another foot." "Then we don't let it rise another foot." Ethan turned to the nearest workers. "Everyone on the east barrier. We're going to redirect the main flow away from that side. It'll put more pressure on the west supports, but we'll have to take that chance." "The west barrier's already at capacity," one of the men protested. "If we push more water that direction, it'll hold. The ground's rockier on that side, better foundation. Trust me." "And if you're wrong?" Ethan met the man's eyes steadily. "Then we're all going for a swim." "But I'm not wrong." They repositioned the barriers according to his instructions, creating a channel that directed the worst of the flood away from the compromised foundation. The gamble was enormous. If the west barrier failed, nothing would stand between the water and the main house. But Ethan had read the land, understood the underlying structure in a way that came from years of observation and hard experience. The west barrier held. Clara saw the moment her father truly understood what was happening. Saw the recognition cross his face that Ethan hadn't just prevented a disaster. He'd orchestrated a minor miracle with nothing but knowledge, determination, and the cooperation of men who should have refused to work with him. The water crested an hour before sunset, the river reaching its highest point, and then, mercifully, beginning to recede. The retreat was painfully slow, but every inch of exposed ground was a victory. The stables stood intact. The main house remained dry. The lower pasture was a swamp, and several equipment sheds had been reduced to debris, but the heart of the ranch had survived. Ethan stood in the middle of the yard, water still swirling around his knees, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The other workers were collapsing where they stood, too tired to celebrate, but Ethan remained upright, his eyes scanning the property for any signs of weakness or failure. James Whitmore slogged through the water toward him, and for a moment Clara held her breath, uncertain what her father would do. "Red Hawk," James said, his voice rough. "Mr. Whitmore." "That was... you did..." He stopped, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come naturally to a man of his pride. Finally, he extended his hand. "Thank you. You saved everything we have." Ethan looked at the offered hand for a long moment before taking it. The handshake was brief, formal, but it represented a bridge Clara had thought impossible just hours before. "Glad I could help," Ethan said simply. "I owe you." "You don't owe me anything. This is what neighbors do. Or should do, anyway." The subtle rebuke in those words wasn't lost on anyone present. Several of the ranch hands had the grace to look ashamed, remembering their own treatment of Ethan over the past weeks. At least stay for dinner, James offered. It's the least we can do. Clara, tell your mother to set an extra place at... He turned toward the house and saw his daughter clinging to the porch railing, her face white with pain but her eyes blazing with something fierce and proud. What in heaven's name are you doing standing out here? Watching history being made, Clara said. Watching the impossible become possible because one man refused to let hatred win. Ethan's eyes found hers across the muddy yard, and in that moment the connection Clara had felt in his cabin, forged in pain and survival and unexpected kindness, flared back to life with an intensity that made her breath catch. You should be resting, Miss Whitmore, he said quietly. I've rested enough. Some things are worth the pain of witnessing. The dinner that followed was an awkward affair, but not an unkind one. Margaret Whitmore set the table with trembling hands, her worldview clearly shaken by having to host the man she'd called a savage in her own dining room. The ranch hands who'd been invited to join them, a gesture of gratitude from James, kept their eyes on their plates and spoke in monosyllables. But Clara spoke freely, asking Ethan about the flood barriers he'd designed, the principles of water redirection he'd employed, where he'd learned such techniques. His answers were measured and practical, delivered without arrogance but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his worth regardless of others' opinions. You said you worked the Missouri breaks, James ventured, his curiosity finally overcoming his discomfort. That's brutal country. How long were you up there? 3 years? Hired on as general labor, but the foreman figured out I could read water and land better than most. Taught me everything he knew about managing spring floods. Ethan's expression grew distant. Lost him in the flood of 71. River took out a whole settlement that year. After that, I headed south, wound up here. I remember hearing about that flood, one of the older ranch hands said. They say over 100 people died. 137, Ethan's voice was flat. I helped pull bodies from the water for a week afterward. Learned what happens when people ignore the signs, when they build in flood zones because the land's cheap, when they trust luck instead of preparation. The table fell silent. Clara saw her mother dab at her eyes with her napkin, the first genuine emotion she'd shown toward Ethan since the whole ordeal began. I misjudged you, James said finally. I let my concern for my daughter's reputation cloud my judgment of your character. That was wrong. Ethan set down his fork, meeting James's eyes directly. You weren't entirely wrong to be concerned. A man in my position, native blood, no property, no family name, I'm always going to be suspect in people's minds. Your daughter's reputation did suffer because I helped her. That's the reality of the world we live in. But it shouldn't be, Clara interjected. The reality of the world is what we make it. And if we keep accepting that prejudice and hatred are just the way things are, nothing will ever change. Change doesn't happen because individuals wish it would, Margaret said softly. It happens slowly, painfully, over generations. Or it happens in a single afternoon when one man proves everything people believed about him was a lie. Clara's eyes never left Ethan's face. You showed them today. Showed everyone that competence and character have nothing to do with bloodline or social position. That's worth more than 100 polite dinner parties where everyone smiles and lies through their teeth. Ethan's expression remained neutral, but Clara saw something flicker in his eyes. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or the ghost of gratitude he was too proud to voice. After dinner, the men retreated to the porch to smoke and assess the damage to the property. Clara remained at the table, too exhausted from her earlier exertion to attempt the stairs again. She could hear their voices through the open window, her father's deep rumble mixing with Ethan's quieter tones. The lower pasture will need to be drained, Ethan was saying. Probably take a week for the water to recede completely. You'll want to check for sinkholes before you turn the cattle back out. You sound like you're planning to stick around. A pause. Hadn't planned on it, no. This was a one-time thing, helping with the flood. Don't expect it changes anything between us. What if I wanted it to change things? James's voice carried an unfamiliar note, something almost like humility. What if I offered you steady work? A position as ranch foreman, fair wages, decent housing? Clara's heart leapt, but Ethan's response was immediate and firm. Can't accept that, Mr. Whitmore. Why not? You clearly have the skills for it. The men would follow you. They proved that today. The men followed me because they were desperate, and I was the only option. Come tomorrow, when the crisis has passed, they'll remember what I am, and I won't put myself in a position where I'm dependent on your charity or anyone else's. It wouldn't be charity. You'd earn every cent. Maybe, but your daughter's already paid a high enough price for my involvement in her life. I won't make it worse by becoming a permanent fixture around here. Clara can make her own decisions about, can she? Ethan's voice went hard. Because from where I stand, her decisions have cost her an engagement, her social standing, and most of her mother's respect. All because she refused to lie about me. I won't reward that kind of loyalty by making her life even more complicated. Clara pushed herself up from the table, ignoring the screaming protest from her leg, and hobbled to the window. Both men turned at the sound of her approach. Don't I get a say in this? She demanded. Clara, you should be resting, her father started, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. I'm tired of being told what I should be doing, what I should say, what I should feel, who I should protect, and who I should condemn. She gripped the windowsill for support, her eyes locked on Ethan. You saved my life twice now. Once in the desert, and once today by saving everything my family has built. But you won't save me from the consequence of telling the truth about you? The truth has already cost you enough. The truth has set me free. Can't you see that? William Morrison was never going to make me happy. That life, those people, I was suffocating and didn't even realize it until I fell off that horse and you showed me what it means to be competent, honest, and brave without needing anyone's approval. Ethan's jaw tightened. Miss Whitmore. Clara. My name is Clara, and I'm tired of you putting distance between us with formality and noble self-sacrifice. She released the windowsill, swaying slightly but keeping her balance. You think you're protecting me by staying away, but all you're doing is letting them win, letting prejudice and fear dictate both our futures. What would you have me do? The question came out rough, edged with frustration. Accept your father's offer and pretend everything's fine? Ignore the fact that half this valley would love an excuse to run me out, or worse? That being associated with me professionally would destroy whatever reputation you have left? I would have you stop assuming you know what's best for me. Stop deciding my future without asking what I want. Then tell me. He stepped closer to the window, close enough that Clara could see the exhaustion in his face, the weight of the day's labor in the set of his shoulders. What do you want? The question hung between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond employment or reputation. Clara felt her father shift uncomfortably behind her, but she didn't break eye contact with Ethan. I want to live in a world where a good man doesn't have to apologize for existing, she said quietly. Where kindness isn't punished and competence isn't questioned based on bloodline. I want to be part of building that world instead of accepting the broken one we inherited. That's a nice dream, Clara, but the world doesn't change just because we want it to. No. It changes because someone has the courage to demand better, to stand up and say this is wrong, this has to stop, I will not participate in this ugliness anymore. She took a painful step forward, closing the distance between them. Today you showed this entire ranch what real leadership looks like. You could have refused to help. After everything we've done to you, everything this family has said about you, you had every right to let us fail. But you came anyway because it was right. I came because animals don't deserve to suffer for human stupidity. You came because you're a better man than any of us deserve. And I'll be damned if I let you walk away now thinking you're doing me a favor by keeping your distance. James cleared his throat. Clara, perhaps this conversation should wait until you've both had time to what? Cool down? Think rationally? Decide that the sensible thing is to go back to our separate worlds and pretend this never happened? Clara shook her head fiercely. I'm done being sensible, Father. Done being the good daughter who colors inside the lines and never questions the rules. Those rules are poisonous, and I won't live by them anymore. Even if it costs you everything? Especially then. Because what good is everything if it's built on lies and maintained through cruelty? She turned back to Ethan, seeing her own exhaustion reflected in his eyes, but also something else, a spark of hope struggling against the weight of a lifetime's disappointments. Stay, she said simply. Take the position my father offered. Help us rebuild what the flood damaged, and let me prove that the world can change, one small corner at a time. Ethan studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he shook his head. I can't. The words landed like a physical blow. Clara felt her father's hand on her shoulder, support or restraint, she couldn't tell. Can't or won't, she whispered. Both. Ethan's voice was gentle but immovable. You don't understand what you're asking. It's not just about me accepting a job. It's about you being seen associating with me every day, defending me every time someone questions your judgment, fighting battles you shouldn't have to fight because I'm too stubborn to disappear like I should. What if I want to fight those battles? Then you're braver than I am, but I won't be the reason you have to. He stepped back from the window, his decision clearly made. Clara felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart breaking, but something harder and more fundamental. The realization that courage alone wasn't always enough to overcome the weight of the world's ugliness. So this is it, she said. You save us and then disappear? Let everything go back to the way it was before? Nothing goes back to the way it was. Your father knows what I'm capable of now. The ranch hands know. Maybe that changes something down the line, maybe it doesn't. But I'm not going to be your pet project, Clara. You're proof that prejudice can be overcome through sheer force of will. I've got my own life to live, and it doesn't include being dependent on Whitmore charity or protection. It's not charity. It is. Whether you want to admit it or not. I'm not your equal in this world, and pretending otherwise doesn't change reality. He turned to James. Thank you for dinner, Mr. Whitmore. I'll send Sarah around tomorrow to check on Clara's leg, make sure the splint's holding proper. After that, I'd appreciate if you kept your distance. All of you. He walked away into the gathering darkness, his figure disappearing into the rain that had started falling again, lighter now, almost gentle after the violence of the flood. Clara stood at the window long after he'd gone, staring into the darkness, feeling the weight of defeat settle over her like a shroud. He's trying to protect you, her father said quietly, in his own way. I don't need his protection. I need his respect, his willingness to believe that I'm strong enough to handle whatever comes. Maybe he doesn't believe he's worth the cost you'd pay. The observation was surprisingly insightful, coming from her father. Clara turned to look at him, seeing the conflict in his expression, the old prejudices warring with the new understanding that had been forced on him by necessity. Do you believe he's worth it? She asked. James was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the property Ethan had saved, the stables that still stood because of his knowledge and determination. I believe, he said finally, that I was wrong about a great many things, and that being wrong has consequences I'm only beginning to understand. It wasn't an answer to her question, but it was more than Clara had expected to hear from her father. She leaned against his shoulder, suddenly too tired to stand on her own, and together they watched the rain wash away the last traces of the day's battle, leaving only the scars of what they'd survived and the uncertain promise of what might come next. The days following the flood settled into an uneasy rhythm that felt more like ceasefire than peace. True to his word, Ethan sent Sarah to check on Clara's leg, but he didn't come himself. Sarah arrived each morning with fresh herbs for poultices and a clinical detachment that made it clear she had opinions about the entire situation, but wasn't sharing them. Bones healing straight, she announced on the third day, unwrapping the splint to examine Clara's leg with practiced fingers. Another 5 weeks and you'll be able to put weight on it. 6 before you can walk without assistance. What does Ethan say about it? Clara asked, watching Sarah's face for any reaction. He says the same thing I just told you. Bones healing straight. That's not what I meant. Sarah's hand stilled on the bandages. She looked up, her dark eyes sharp with something between sympathy and exasperation. What do you want me to say, girl? That he asks about you, worries about whether you're following doctor's orders, stays up at night thinking about whether he made the right choice walking away? Does he? What difference would it make if he did? Sarah resumed her work, her movements more forceful than necessary. He made his decision. You need to respect it. Even if it's the wrong decision? Especially then, because it's his to make, not yours. She tied off the fresh bandages with sharp, efficient movements. You think you're the first woman to want to save a man from his own stubbornness? You're not. And you won't be the last to learn that some people would rather suffer alone than accept help that comes with strings attached. I'm not attaching strings, I just want... You want him to let you fight his battles, to be his champion against a world that's been cruel to him since birth. That's noble, Miss Whitmore, truly. But have you considered that maybe he doesn't want a champion? That maybe the last thing he needs is another person making him feel like he can't survive on his own? The words cut deeper than Clara wanted to admit. She'd been so focused on her own convictions, her own need to prove that the world could be better, that she hadn't stopped to ask whether Ethan wanted to be the instrument of that proof. I didn't mean to make him feel weak, she said quietly. Didn't say you did. Said you need to think about what you're offering and whether it's really for him or for yourself. Sarah gathered her supplies, preparing to leave. You lost your engagement, your social standing. Must be tempting to replace all that with a noble cause. Something to make the sacrifice feel worthwhile. That's not what this is, isn't it? Sarah paused at the door, her expression softening slightly. I'm not saying you don't care about my nephew, girl. I'm saying maybe you need to figure out whether you care about him or about what he represents to you. Because there's a difference, and Ethan's too smart not to see it. After she left, Clara lay in bed staring at the ceiling, turning Sarah's words over in her mind like stones. Was she using Ethan to justify her rebellion against the life she'd been raised for? Was her defense of him really about his worth, or about her need to prove she'd made the right choice in throwing away everything her parents had planned? The questions haunted her through the long, empty days of recovery. Meanwhile, the valley slowly returned to normal around her. The floodwaters receded, leaving behind rich deposits of silt that would make the next season's crops unusually productive. The damaged buildings were repaired or rebuilt. Life continued with the relentless forward momentum that characterized frontier communities. Surviving was more important than processing, action more valued than reflection. But something had shifted in how people spoke about Ethan Redhawk. Clara heard it in the snippets of conversation that filtered up from the household staff, from the ranch hands who came to report to her father. The tone had changed from outright hostility to something more grudging, not quite respect, but acknowledgement. He'd proven himself useful, competent, worth tolerating, if not embracing. It was progress, Clara supposed, but it felt hollow compared to what she'd hoped for. Her father spent more time at home during her recovery, unusual for a man who normally conducted business from sunup to sundown. He would sit in the chair beside her bed in the evenings, reading reports or reviewing account books, his presence a silent form of companionship that Clara found surprisingly comforting. The Henderson Ranch is hiring for seasonal work, he said one evening, not looking up from his papers. They specifically asked if Redhawk might be available. Seems word of his performance during the flood has spread. Clara's heart jumped. Did he accept? Haven't asked him yet. Thought I'd see if you had any objections first. Why would I have objections? James finally looked up, removing his reading glasses. Because Henderson's ranch is 40 miles east. If he takes the position, he'll be gone for the better part of 3 months. Housed in the workers' bunkhouse? No time for visits. You wouldn't see him at all. The implication hung heavy between them. Her father was asking, in his oblique way, whether Clara's feelings for Ethan ran deeper than principles and moral outrage, whether his absence would hurt in ways that went beyond philosophy. He should take the work if he wants it, Clara said carefully. It's a good opportunity. That's not what I asked. It's the only answer I can give. She met her father's eyes directly. What do you want me to say? That I'll miss him? That the thought of him being gone for months makes me feel like something's being torn away? I can't say those things, Father, not when he's made it clear he doesn't want my involvement in his life. Hasn't he? James set his papers aside, giving Clara his full attention for the first time in days. Or has he simply decided that wanting you and being good for you are two different things? Clara stared at her father, surprised by the insight. What makes you think he wants? I watched him during the flood. Watched how his eyes found you every time he thought no one was looking. How his voice changed when he spoke to you, got softer somehow, despite trying to maintain that wall of formality. James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I've seen that look before. It's how I looked at your mother before I worked up the courage to court her properly. Like you're afraid to hope for something you're certain you don't deserve. The revelation that her stoic, pragmatic father had ever been uncertain about anything was almost as shocking as the idea that Ethan might harbor feelings he'd never expressed. Even if that's true, Clara said slowly, what difference does it make? He walked away, made his position clear, made the position he thinks he should take clear, not necessarily the one he wants to take. James picked up his papers again, but didn't resume reading. You know what your mother told me when I first asked permission to court her? She said I was too ambitious, too focused on building an empire to make time for a wife. Said I should come back when I'd figured out what mattered more, money or family. What did you do? Spent 6 months proving her wrong. Built this ranch not just to be successful, but to be a place where family could thrive, where children could grow up with both security and freedom. It took time and patience and being willing to show her through actions that I'd heard what she said. He finally met Clara's eyes again. Sometimes the people we care about need us to prove we're serious, that we understand the cost and we're willing to pay it anyway. Are you saying I should chase after him, prove myself somehow? I'm saying you should think about what you really want. And if it's him, not the cause he represents, not the rebellion he enables, but the actual man, then you should figure out how to show him that in a way he can believe. Clara lay awake long into the night, her father's words circling through her mind. What did she want? The question seemed simple, but the answer sprawled in so many directions she could barely trace them all. She wanted Ethan safe, respected, free from the constant threat that came with being different in a world that demanded conformity. But beneath those noble intentions, there was something raw and more personal. She wanted to hear his voice again, wanted to watch his hands move with that quiet competence as he worked, wanted to sit across from him in companionable silence and know she didn't have to perform or pretend or be anything other than exactly who she was. She wanted him. The realization settled over her like certainty, simple and undeniable. But wanting him and knowing how to bridge the distance he'd created were entirely different challenges. The answer came from an unexpected source 2 weeks later, when her mother appeared at her bedroom door with a letter in hand and an expression that managed to be both triumphant and vindictive. This arrived from Senator Morrison's office, Margaret said, her voice tight. Apparently William has reconsidered his decision to end the engagement. Clara's stomach dropped. What? Read it yourself. Margaret thrust the letter at her daughter, then stood with arms crossed, waiting. The letter was written in William's precise handwriting, every word chosen for maximum diplomatic impact. He acknowledged his hasty decision to break the engagement, blamed it on the influence of advisors who'd overreacted to mere rumors. He suggested that with Clara's reputation now somewhat restored thanks to her father's efforts to control the narrative, they could proceed with the wedding as planned, though perhaps on a smaller scale, with fewer public announcements. This is absurd, Clara said, letting the letter fall to the coverlet. I don't want to marry William. I never did. What you want has never been the point. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. What matters is securing your future. You're 23 years old with a broken leg and a ruined reputation. Do you think suitors will be lining up once you're healed? Do you think you'll have better offers than William Morrison? I'd rather have no offers than marry a man who sees me as a liability he's willing to overlook. Then you're a fool. Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. You think love matters more than security? You think passion will keep you fed and housed when you're 40 and alone? I married your father because he could provide the life I wanted. The love came later, built on respect and partnership. That's how marriages work in the real world. Maybe I don't want to live in the real world. Maybe I want to build a better one. With who? That half-breed who can barely keep himself employed? Who'll be run out of every town you try to settle in? Who'll make you a pariah everywhere you go? Margaret's voice rose to near hysteria. Is that the future you want? Poverty and prejudice, and watching your children suffer because their father's blood isn't pure enough for polite society? The words hung in the air like poison. Clara felt something inside her go very still and very cold. Get out, she said quietly. Clara, get out of my room, now. Margaret fled, her exit more of a retreat than a departure. Clara sat alone with William's letter, her mother's words echoing in her ears, and the dawning realization that this was the crossroads. This was the moment where she either committed fully to the path she'd chosen or retreated back to the safe, suffocating world she'd been raised for. She was still sitting there an hour later when her father knocked and entered without waiting for permission. Your mother told me about Morrison's letter, he said, settling into his usual chair. She seems to think you'll accept. She's wrong. James nodded as though he'd expected nothing else. I thought as much. Which means we need to discuss your future in practical terms. You can't stay here indefinitely, Clara. Not in this house. Not under my protection. If you're going to reject Morrison and everything he represents, you need to have a plan for what comes next. The bluntness of the statement was almost refreshing after weeks of dancing around the truth. What do you suggest? Clara asked. I suggest you decide what you want and then pursue it with the same stubbornness you've shown in defending Red Hawk. He pulled a small ledger from his jacket pocket, setting it on the bedside table. I've set aside money in your name. Not a fortune, but enough to buy a small property, support yourself for a year or two if you're careful. It's yours, regardless of what you decide. Clara stared at the ledger, understanding the magnitude of what her father was offering. Independence, the means to forge her own path without being beholden to husband or family. Why? She whispered. Because I raised you to be strong and smart, and then spent 23 years punishing you for being exactly that. Because watching you defend Red Hawk made me ashamed of my own cowardice in the face of social pressure. Because you deserve better than Morrison, better than this valley, better than the small, mean world we've all accepted as inevitable. He stood, moving toward the door. You've got 5 weeks until that leg heals. Use them to figure out what you actually want, and then, when you can walk again, go get it. After he left, Clara opened the ledger with shaking hands. The numbers inside represented more than money. They represented possibility, the freedom to choose her own future without calculation or compromise. She thought about Ethan in his bare cabin, choosing isolation over charity, about Sarah's challenge to examine her own motives, about her mother's fear that love without security led only to suffering. And then she thought about how she'd felt watching Ethan command respect through sheer competence during the flood. How right it had seemed to see him acknowledged for what he was worth. How the thought of never seeing him again created a hollow ache in her chest that had nothing to do with principles or rebellion. Sarah was right about one thing. Clara needed to understand what she was offering and why. But her father was also right. Understanding only mattered if she had the courage to act on it. The plan formed slowly over the following weeks, taking shape as Clara's body healed and her resolve strengthened. She would buy property outside town, somewhere she could live independently without being under her family's roof or anyone's protection. She would learn to manage her own affairs, prove she could survive without a husband's name or a father's influence. And then, only then, would she approach Ethan again. Not as a woman who needed to be saved or a society girl playing at rebellion, but as someone who'd earned the right to stand beside him as an equal. Sarah continued her visits, watching Clara's progress with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. You're planning something, she observed one morning, testing the strength in Clara's leg as she practiced putting weight on it. Got that look in your eyes. Same one Ethan gets when he's made up his mind about something difficult. I'm planning to buy the old Peterson property, Clara said. The one east of town, near the creek. It's been abandoned for 2 years since they moved to California. I thought I might fix it up, make it livable. Sarah's hands stilled. That's rough country out there. Houses falling apart, no neighbors for miles. You planning to live there alone? For now. And what does your family think of this plan? My father's given me the means to do it. My mother thinks I've lost my mind, but it's my decision, and I'm making it. Sarah resumed her examination, but Clara saw the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Peterson Place is only about 3 miles from Ethan's cabin. That a coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. Girl, if you're doing this to be close to him, I'm doing this for myself, Clara interrupted firmly, to prove I can survive on my own terms, to build something that's mine, not a prize someone else bestowed or a refuge someone else provides. What happens after that depends on whether Ethan can see the difference between charity and partnership. Sarah sat back, studying Clara with an expression that might have been approval. You've grown up some since that fall. Still got a lot to learn about how hard life can be outside the protection of money and family name, but maybe you're strong enough to handle it. I am. We'll see. Sarah packed up her supplies, but paused at the door. For what it's worth, Ethan took that job at the Henderson Ranch. Left 3 days ago. Won't be back until late autumn. The news hit Clara harder than she'd expected, but she kept her expression neutral. Then I'll have plenty of time to get settled before he returns. Settled and alone and probably discovering that living in isolation isn't the romantic adventure you think it is. Probably, but I'll discover it for myself instead of being told about it secondhand. Sarah's smile widened into something genuine. You might actually be worthy of him after all. Don't make me regret saying that. The day Clara could finally walk without assistance came exactly 6 weeks after Ethan had set her broken leg in his cabin. She took her first careful steps across her bedroom floor, each movement a victory hard won through pain and patience and stubborn determination. Her father was waiting in the hallway, watching through the open door as she made the journey from bed to window and back again without falling. Strong enough to travel? He asked. Strong enough to start. 2 days later, Clara stood in front of the Peterson property with a wagon full of supplies and a determination that burned brighter than her fear. The house was indeed falling apart, roof sagging, windows broken, porch steps rotted through. But beneath the decay, she could see solid bones, a stone foundation that had weathered decades, walls that were still plumb despite years of neglect. It would take work, months of it probably, but it was hers. The first week was brutal. Clara learned that knowing how to manage household staff was entirely different from doing the work yourself. Blisters formed on her soft hands within hours. Her back ached from hauling water from the creek. The isolation she'd thought she wanted felt oppressive when night fell and the darkness pressed in from all sides. But she didn't quit. Every morning she woke, assessed what needed to be done, and did it. Slowly, painfully, the house began to transform. She patched the roof with salvaged wood, replaced broken windows with oiled paper until she could afford glass, scrubbed years of dirt from the floors until the original planks showed through. Sarah came to visit once, bringing supplies and what might have been grudging respect. "Surprised you're still here," she said, surveying Clara's progress. "Thought you'd have run back to your father's house after the first week." "I'm stubborn," Clara said, her hands wrapped in bandages to protect the worst of the blisters. "Seems to run in the family." "Ethan's family now, is he?" "I meant my family, but if he were here, I'd like to think he'd recognize the stubbornness as something we have in common." Sarah helped her repair the worst of the porch damage, her experienced hands moving with practiced efficiency that reminded Clara painfully of Ethan. They worked in companionable silence for hours before Sarah finally spoke again. "He writes to me sometimes," she said, not looking up from the board she was planning. "From the Henderson Ranch. Sends money when he has it. Asks about you when he thinks I won't notice." Clara's hands stilled. "What does he ask?" "Whether you're healing proper, whether you went back to that Morrison boy, whether you're still at your father's house." Sarah set down her plane, meeting Clara's eyes. "I told him you bought this place. Told him you're fixing it up yourself, living out here alone, learning what it means to survive on your own terms." "What did he say?" "Nothing, but he sent extra money in the next letter. Told me to make sure you had what you needed to get through winter. Didn't say it was for you specifically, but we both knew what he meant." The knowledge that Ethan was thinking about her, worrying about her despite the distance he'd put between them, settled around Clara's heart like warmth. It wasn't a declaration or a promise, but it was something. Evidence that she hadn't imagined the connection between them, that it endured even through separation and stubbornness and all the practical reasons they should forget each other. "When does he come back?" Clara asked. "Late October, assuming the Henderson work lasts that long. Might be earlier if they finish the harvest ahead of schedule." It was early August. Clara had at most 3 months to finish making the house livable, to prove she could survive alone, to transform herself from the sheltered girl who'd fallen from a horse into someone who could meet Ethan as an equal. 3 months to become worthy of the second chance she was determined to earn. She threw herself into the work with renewed intensity. Every day brought new challenges and small victories. She learned to split wood properly after nearly taking off her foot with the axe. Learned to read the creek for the best places to catch fish. Learned which plants were edible and which would make her sick. Learned that loneliness was survivable, that silence could be peaceful instead of oppressive, that she was stronger than anyone, including herself, had given her credit for. Her parents visited once, arriving in a fine carriage that looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of Clara's modest repairs. Her mother wept at the sight of her daughter's rough hands and simple dress. Her father walked through the house in silence, examining what Clara had accomplished with an expression she couldn't read. "This is madness," Margaret said finally. "Living out here alone, working like a common laborer. Come home, Clara. You've made your point. You've proven you're independent. Now come home before you ruin yourself completely." "I'm not trying to prove anything to you, Mother. I'm building a life I can actually live in." "A life of poverty and isolation? That's what you choose over everything we offered you?" "I choose freedom over comfort, truth over lies, my own path over someone else's plan for me." Clara met her mother's tear-filled eyes without flinching. "I know you don't understand, but someday, maybe you will." Her father said nothing until they were preparing to leave. Then he pulled Clara aside, pressing something into her hand. When she opened her palm, she found a small leather pouch, heavy with coins. "For winter supplies," he said gruffly. "Creek floods in spring sometimes. You'll want sandbags stored before the snow melts." The practical advice, delivered without judgment or criticism, meant more than any declaration of support could have. Clara hugged her father tightly, feeling his surprise before his arms came around her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing I could do this." "I always believed it," he said. "Just took me too long to admit it." September arrived with cooler nights and the first hints of autumn color in the trees. Clara's house was nearly finished, still simple, still rough around the edges, but weatherproof and sturdy. She'd even managed to install a small stove she'd bought from a family moving east, trading labor for the price difference when her money ran short. She was standing on her repaired porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rust, when she saw a figure on horseback approaching from the west. Her heart stopped, then started again with painful intensity. Even from a distance, even in the fading light, she recognized the way he sat a horse. The quiet economy of movement that wasted no energy. The careful scan of the surroundings that came from years of watching for danger. Ethan had come home early. He pulled up at the edge of her property, taking in the repaired house, the neat woodpile, the small garden she'd coaxed into existence beside the creek. When his eyes finally found Clara on the porch, his expression was carefully neutral. But she saw the surprise there, and beneath it, something that might have been relief. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying across the evening quiet. "Mr. Redhawk." Clara gripped the porch railing to keep her hands from shaking. "You're back earlier than expected. Harvest finished ahead of schedule. Henderson paid fare and sent me home." He dismounted but didn't approach closer. "Sarah told me you'd bought the Peterson place. Didn't quite believe it until now." "Why not?" "Because people like you don't usually last more than a week when they try to play at frontier living." The words should have stung, but Clara heard the question beneath them. The challenge. The need to know if she was real or just another privileged woman playing at rebellion. "Come see for yourself whether I'm playing," she said, gesturing toward the house. "I'll make coffee. We can talk like civilized people instead of shouting across my property." Ethan hesitated, clearly wrestling with whether to maintain his distance or accept the invitation. Finally, he tied his horse to the porch rail and climbed the steps Clara had repaired with her own hands. Up close, she could see he'd lost weight during his time at the Henderson Ranch. Hard work and long hours had carved him down to essential elements, muscle and bone, and the quiet strength that had attracted her from the first moment he'd stepped out of the desert to save her life. "Nice work on the porch," he said, running his hand along the railing. "Joints are solid. You do this yourself?" Sarah helped with some of it, but mostly, yes. He nodded, following her inside. She saw him take in the simple furnishings, the clean floor, the stove that actually worked, saw the surprise deepen into something like respect. Clara made coffee in silence, her hands steady despite the chaos in her chest. When she handed him a cup, their fingers brushed, and she felt the shock of contact like electricity. "Why?" Ethan asked finally, the single word carrying the weight of everything unspoken between them. "Why go through all this? You had everything at your father's house. Comfort, security, family. Why trade it for isolation and hard labor?" "Because none of those things were mine," Clara said simply. "They were borrowed, contingent on me playing a role I couldn't sustain. This house, this life. It's smaller and harder, but it's real. It belongs to me because I built it." "And what happens when winter comes?" When you're snowed in alone for weeks? When the creek freezes and you have to haul water from town? When wolves come down from the mountains looking for easy prey? His voice was sharp with something that sounded like fear. You think you can survive all that on stubbornness alone? No, I think I'll survive it the same way you do, by learning what I need to know, by being prepared, by refusing to quit even when it's hard. She set down her coffee cup, meeting his eyes directly. I'm not doing this to prove anything to you, Ethan. I'm doing it because I finally understand what you tried to tell me. That charity and protection aren't the same as partnership. That I can't stand beside you as an equal while I'm dependent on my family's name and money. You think becoming a homesteader makes you my equal? I think surviving on my own terms gives us common ground to build on, if we choose to. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Ethan's hands tightened around his cup, his knuckles going white with the force of whatever he was holding back. You're still the Whitmore daughter, he said finally. Still from a world I'll never belong to. This house doesn't change that. You're right, it doesn't change where I came from, but it changes where I'm going. And where I'm going is away from that world and everything it represents. The question is whether you can see me as I am now, instead of who I used to be. Clara. The use of her first name, after weeks of careful formality, felt like a surrender. You don't know what you're asking, don't know what it costs to be with someone like me. Then tell me. Stop protecting me from truths you think I can't handle, and tell me exactly what I'd be choosing. Ethan set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, as though afraid any sudden movement might shatter the fragile moment between them. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of accumulated hurt. You'd be choosing whispers that never stop, he said. Every time we go to town, people crossing the street to avoid us. Shopkeepers who suddenly don't have what you need in stock. Children who'll throw rocks at our windows because they've heard their parents talk. You'd be choosing to watch doors close in your face that used to open automatically because of your name. I've already experienced most of that, Clara said quietly. The whispers started the day I defended you. The doors have been closing for months. It gets worse, much worse. He stood, pacing to the window as though he couldn't sit still while saying these things. You'd be choosing poverty, real poverty, not the kind where you have to economize, but the kind where you go to bed hungry because there's not enough food to go around. I can work myself to exhaustion and still barely scrape by because half the ranches won't hire me, and the ones that do pay me less than white workers for the same labor. Then we work together, pool our resources, find a way to survive that doesn't depend on their approval. He turned to face her, his expression almost angry. And children, Clara? Have you thought about that? About what it means to bring children into a world that will never fully accept them? They'll be too native for the white community, and too white for what's left of my people. They'll belong nowhere, fit nowhere, spend their whole lives explaining themselves to people who've already made up their minds. The words hit Clara like physical blows, but she didn't flinch. I've thought about it, about all of it, and I'm still here. Why? The question burst from him with raw frustration. Why throw your life away for this? For me? You could go back to your father's house right now, write a letter to Morrison saying you've reconsidered, and in 6 months this would all be a strange story you tell at dinner parties about your wild phase. Is that what you want me to do? I want you to be smart. To choose the life that will make you happy instead of the one that will break you down year by year until you're just bitter and worn out and wondering what you were thinking. Clara stood, moving closer to him with her still healing leg protesting the sudden movement. You want to know what would break me? Going back to that life. Smiling through endless dinner parties while my soul shrivels. Pretending to be grateful for a husband who sees me as property and a society that measures my worth by my ability to conform. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough to see the conflict in his dark eyes. That would break me, Ethan. This surviving out here, working until my hands bleed, building something real? This makes me stronger. Until the first real crisis. Until you get sick, or the crops fail, or winter hits harder than you expected, and you realize this romantic notion of frontier independence is just hunger and cold and fear. Then I'll survive that too. The same way you have. The same way everyone out here does. She reached up, her hand hovering near his face without quite touching. I'm not asking you to save me, Ethan. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you, to stop assuming I'm too fragile to handle whatever comes and give me the chance to prove I'm stronger than you think. For a long moment he didn't move. Then slowly, his hand came up to cover hers, pressing her palm against his cheek. The contact sent electricity through Clara's entire body. You're going to regret this, he said, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer suppress. Somewhere down the line, when it's been years of struggling and you see your old friends living in comfort, you're going to wake up and wonder what the hell you were thinking choosing this life. Maybe, but I'd regret walking away from you more. I'd regret never knowing what we could build together. I'd regret letting fear and prejudice make my choices instead of following what I know is right. She turned her face into his palm, feeling the calluses earned through years of hard labor. I love you, Ethan Redhawk. Not the idea of you, not what you represent, not the rebellion you enable. You, the man who saved my life without hesitation, who stood alone against a flood and saved everything my family had built, who's honest enough to tell me hard truths even when pretty lies would be easier. The words hung between them, raw and irrevocable. Ethan's eyes closed as though in pain, and when he opened them again, Clara saw something break in his expression, the last wall of resistance crumbling under the weight of what he could no longer deny. I love you too, he said, the admission seeming to cost him everything. Have since that first night in my cabin, watching you refuse to cry even though I knew the pain was unbearable. Watching you be brave and stubborn and real in ways I'd never seen from anyone in your world. His other hand came up to frame her face, his touch gentle despite the roughness of his palms. But loving you and being good for you are two different things. Let me decide what's good for me. Clara? She kissed him before he could construct another argument, before he could find another reason to push her away. His surprise lasted only a heartbeat before he responded, pulling her closer with a desperate intensity that spoke of months of denial and longing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. This is a mistake, he whispered, but his arms remained locked around her. Then it's mine to make. Ours, he corrected. If we do this, it's ours. The mistakes, the consequences, the struggle, all of it. Good. I'm tired of carrying burdens alone. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the gathering darkness of Clara's modest house, and Clara felt something settle in her chest that she'd never experienced before. Peace. Certainty. The bone-deep knowledge that whatever came next, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The next weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and revelation. Ethan didn't move into Clara's house immediately. Propriety still mattered, even in isolation. But he came by each day to help with the heavier work, to teach her the skills she'd need to survive winter, to simply be near her in the way they'd both denied themselves for months. They worked in companionable silence most days, their communication more about shared purpose than words. Ethan showed her how to smoke meat properly for storage, how to bank the stove to keep coals alive through the night, how to read the sky for coming weather. Clara surprised him with her quick learning, her refusal to give up when tasks proved difficult, her growing competence in a world she'd been raised to avoid. You're tougher than I gave you credit for, he admitted one evening as they sat on her porch watching the sunset. Thought for sure you'd have called it quits by now. I'm stubborn. Thought you'd figured that out already. Stubborn, yes, but there's a difference between stubborn and strong. You're both. The compliment, delivered in his characteristically understated way, warmed Clara more than any flowery praise from her former life could have. But their peace was fragile, and the world beyond Clara's property line hadn't forgotten or forgiven. The trouble started in early October when Clara rode to town for supplies. She'd avoided the trip for weeks, sending Sarah when possible. But certain items required her presence. Legal papers for the property, tools the general store had to order special. The moment she dismounted in front of the mercantile, the whispers started. Women clustered together, their voices carrying just loud enough for Clara to hear. Living out there alone with that savage bold as brass, at least she has the decency to look ashamed. Does she? I think she looks proud. Proud of throwing away everything decent for, well, we all know what for. Clara kept her expression neutral, untying her horse and heading inside. The store owner, Mr. Hendricks, greeted her with painful politeness, the kind reserved for customers whose money you'll take but whose presence you resent. "Miss Whitmore, I have those tools you ordered, and a letter came for you from San Francisco." The letter bore William Morrison's seal. Clara tucked it into her pocket unopened, knowing whatever it contained would only be another attempt to pull her back into the life she'd escaped. "How much do I owe you?" Hendricks named a price that was easily double what the tools should cost. Clara started to protest, then caught the look in his eyes. Shame mixed with defiance. He needed her money but resented needing it, and he was taking his resentment out in the only way he could. She paid without argument, gathering her purchases and heading for the door. That's when she saw them, a group of ranch hands from the Morrison property, lounging outside the saloon across the street. One of them was Tommy Blake, who'd worked for Clara's father before being fired for drinking on the job. "Well, well," Tommy called out, his voice thick with whiskey despite the early hour. "If it isn't the Whitmore whore, come to town to find some white men for a change?" Clara's hands tightened on her packages, but she kept walking toward her horse. Engaging would only make things worse. "What's the matter?" Tommy pushed off from the wall, his friends following. "Too good to talk to us now? You'll spread your legs for an Indian, but you won't give decent white men the time of day." "Leave her alone, Tommy." The voice came from an unexpected source, one of her father's current ranch hands, a young man named Daniel. "She hasn't done anything to you." "Hasn't done anything? She's disgraced the whole valley with her behavior, making a mockery of decent women everywhere, acting like a woman who makes her own choices?" Clara turned to face them, her fear transforming into fury. "Like someone who refuses to marry a man she doesn't love just to make people like you comfortable? Yes, I suppose I'm making a mockery of that?" Tommy's face flushed red. "You think you're better than us because you've got Whitmore money? You're nothing but a—" He didn't finish the sentence because Ethan's fist connected with his jaw with a crack that echoed down the street. Tommy went down hard, his head bouncing off the wooden sidewalk. His friends scattered, suddenly very interested in being elsewhere. Ethan stood over Tommy's prone form, his expression carved from stone. "Speak to her like that again, and I won't stop at one punch." "We clear?" Tommy groaned, blood streaming from his nose. "You're a dead man, half-breed. Morrison's going to what?" Ethan's voice dropped to something dangerous. "Come after me himself? Send his lackeys to do his dirty work? I've survived worse than Senator Morrison's wounded pride. But you touch Clara, you even look at her wrong, and you'll discover exactly how much worse I can make things for you." He turned away from Tommy like he was nothing, crossing to where Clara stood frozen by her horse. "You all right?" "I'm fine. You didn't have to—" "Yes, I did." His hand found hers, squeezing gently. "Let's go home." They rode back to Clara's property in silence, the town's hostility hanging over them like a storm cloud. It wasn't until they were safely inside that Clara allowed herself to shake. "It's going to get worse," she said, more to herself than to Ethan. "What Tommy said, that's what they all think, that I'm some kind of a fallen woman who—" "I know what they think." Ethan pulled her into his arms, his embrace warm and solid. "I've known since the beginning. The question is whether you can live with it." Clara thought about Tommy's words, the venom in them, the casual cruelty. Thought about the women whispering, the shopkeeper overcharging, the looks that followed her everywhere she went. "I can live with it," she said finally. "What I can't live with is letting them make me ashamed of choosing you. That's my girl." The endearment, so simple and unexpected, made Clara's throat tight with emotion. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of leather and sage, and let herself believe that love might actually be enough to weather what was coming. But she was wrong. The first real test came 2 weeks later when Clara woke in the night with chills racking her body. At first she thought it was just the cold. Autumn had given way to early winter, and frost painted the windows each morning. But by the time pale light crept through the curtains, she was burning with fever. Ethan found her that afternoon when she didn't come to the door for their usual work session. He took one look at her flushed face and glassy eyes and cursed under his breath. "How long have you been like this?" "Since last night. It's nothing, just a cold." "It's not a cold." He pressed his hand to her forehead, his expression darkening. "You're burning up. When did you last eat? Clara tried to remember and couldn't. The room spun around her, and Ethan's voice seemed to come from very far away. The next days passed in a blur of fever dreams and moments of terrible clarity. Ethan moved into her house, propriety be damned, nursing her with the same skill he'd used to set her broken leg. He forced water and broth down her throat when she was lucid enough to swallow, changed the cool cloths on her forehead when the fever spiked, held her when the chills got so bad her teeth chattered too hard to speak. "Don't you dare die on me," she heard him say during one of her more lucid moments. "Not after everything we've been through. You hear me, Clara? You stay with me." She wanted to reassure him, to tell him she was fighting, but darkness pulled her under again before she could form the words. Sarah came, her face grim as she examined Clara's symptoms. "It's the fever that's been going through the valley. Took 3 people already this month. Young, old, doesn't seem to matter. What can we do?" Ethan's voice was raw with fear. "Keep her cool when the fever spikes. Keep her warm when the chills hit. Get as much liquid into her as she'll take. Beyond that," Sarah's expression softened. "Beyond that, you pray she's strong enough to fight it." "She's strong enough?" "She has to be." Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of Ethan's presence beside her bed, like an anchor keeping her from floating away entirely. She heard voices, her father's deep rumble, her mother's tearful pleas, but couldn't muster the strength to respond. At some point, she had no idea how much time had passed. She opened her eyes to find Ethan slumped in the chair beside her bed, his head resting on his crossed arms, his hand still clutching hers even in exhausted sleep. He looked terrible, gaunt, unshaven, his eyes sunken with fatigue. How long had he been here? Days? Weeks? "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. His head snapped up instantly, his eyes focusing on her face with desperate intensity. "Clara, how do you feel?" "Like I was trampled by a horse, maybe several horses." She tried to smile, but it felt more like a grimace. "How long?" 8 days. The fever broke last night, but you've been sleeping since then." He pressed his lips to her knuckles, and Clara felt the tremor in his hands. "I thought I was going to lose you. Takes more than a fever to get rid of me." "Don't joke. You nearly died, multiple times. If Sarah hadn't known which herbs to use, if your father hadn't brought medicine from town..." His voice broke. "I've never felt so helpless in my life." Clara squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. "You saved me. Again. Your father saved you by getting the medicine. Sarah saved you with her knowledge. I just sat here and watched you suffer and couldn't do a damn thing about it. You stayed. That's what mattered." She saw something shift in his expression, a realization dawning that seemed to cost him everything to acknowledge. "Your parents have been here every day. Your father brought every doctor within 50 miles to consult. Your mother hasn't left except to get fresh supplies. They love you, Clara. Regardless of the choices you've made, regardless of how disappointed they might be, they love you." "I know. And they saw me here, saw me caring for you, sleeping in your house, doing things no unmarried man should be doing under a woman's roof. They saw all of it and didn't say a word. Didn't try to send me away or question my presence, or..." He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "Your father thanked me. Actually thanked me for taking care of you when they couldn't." Clara heard what he wasn't saying, heard the shock of being treated with respect, with gratitude, with the basic dignity he'd been denied for so long. "Maybe people can change," she said softly. "Maybe. Or maybe crisis brings out the truth in people, shows you who they really are when everything else is stripped away." Over the next weeks, as Clara slowly regained her strength, she saw what Ethan meant. Her parents visited regularly, bringing supplies and news from town. The awkwardness remained, but beneath it was something new, acceptance, tentative and uncomfortable, but real. Her father brought timber one afternoon, premium wood he'd had shipped from the coast. "For the addition," he said gruffly, gesturing to the spot where Ethan had suggested expanding Clara's house to include a proper second room. "Figure you'll need more space eventually." The implication that Clara and Ethan would be building a life together, a life that might include children and permanence, hung unspoken but understood. Margaret came bearing quilts and preserves, Practical gifts from a woman who'd spent her life preparing for society balls, but was learning a new kind of usefulness. "I was wrong," she said one afternoon, sitting beside Clara's bed while Ethan worked outside. "About what matters, about what makes a good marriage. I thought security was everything, but watching your father these past weeks, watching him pace and worry and pray for you to survive, I realized I'd confused security with love somewhere along the way." She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "He does love me. I know that now. But I also know he didn't love me the way Red Hawk loves you. Not at first. Maybe not ever quite like that." "What way is that?" "Like you're the reason he draws breath. Like losing you would end him." Margaret's voice trembled. "He didn't leave your side for 8 days, Clara. Didn't sleep except in that chair. Didn't eat unless Sarah forced food on him. That kind of devotion, you don't find it in arranged marriages or society matches. You find it when two people choose each other despite the world telling them they shouldn't." The conversation shifted something in Clara's understanding of her mother. Beneath the social climbing and obsession with reputation had been a woman who'd settled for a good enough marriage and convinced herself it was love, who'd wanted more for her daughter but hadn't known how to articulate it, except through the language of security and status. "I'm happy, Mother," Clara said gently. "Happier than I ever would have been married to William Morrison." "I'm beginning to see that. Doesn't mean I'm happy about you living in poverty and isolation, but—" Margaret managed a watery smile. "But maybe happiness matters more than I gave it credit for." Winter arrived in earnest, bringing snow that blanketed the valley and ice that turned the creek into a frozen ribbon. Clara's house, fortified by Ethan's knowledge and her father's materials, weathered the cold better than she'd dared hope. The stove kept them warm, the stored food kept them fed, and the isolation that had seemed daunting became a cocoon of safety. Ethan officially moved in 2 weeks before Christmas, the last pretense of propriety abandoned in favor of practical sense and honest desire. They worked together preparing the house for the deepest cold, their movements synchronized with the ease of long partnership. "Marry me," Ethan said one evening as they sat by the fire, Clara mending a shirt and Ethan carving something from a piece of scrap wood. The proposal was so casual, delivered in such an ordinary tone, that Clara thought she'd misheard. "What?" "Marry me. Make it official. Stop giving the town something to gossip about and give them something real to disapprove of instead." Clara set down her mending, studying his face in the firelight. "That's possibly the worst proposal I've ever heard." "It's the only proposal you've heard from me, so technically it's also the best." His lips quirked into something that might have been a smile. "I'm not William Morrison. I can't offer you a society wedding or a mansion in San Francisco or any of the things you were raised to expect. But I can offer you honesty, partnership, a life built on something real instead of appearance. Yes." "Yes?" He looked up from his carving, surprise flickering across his features. "Just like that?" "Just like that. I didn't survive falling off a horse, a broken leg, a flood, social exile, and a near-fatal fever just to say no when the man I love finally asked me to marry him." She moved to sit beside him, tucking herself against his side. "Though you could have made it slightly more romantic." "I'm working on that part." He held up the carving he'd been working on. A delicate horse mid-leap, every detail rendered with painstaking care. "Wedding present. Figured you'd want something to remember that fall by, since it brought us together." Clara took the carving with trembling hands, seeing the love and skill evident in every carved line. "It's beautiful." "So are you, even with your hair tangled and your hands rough from work and wearing a dress that's been mended 6 times. Especially then, actually. That's when you're most real." They married in January, in a ceremony so small it barely qualified as such. Sarah presided, Clara's parents stood witness, and the words spoken were simple promises delivered in the front room of the house Clara and Ethan had built together. No flowers, no music, no hundreds of guests in fine clothes. Just 2 people choosing each other in front of the few who mattered, binding their lives together with honesty instead of pageantry. James Whitmore shook Ethan's hand afterward, his grip firm and his eyes suspiciously bright. "Take care of my daughter." "Every day for the rest of my life," Ethan promised. Margaret embraced Clara tightly, whispering in her ear, "Be happy, darling. That's all I really wanted for you, even when I didn't know how to say it." The valley's reaction was predictable. Whispers intensified. Certain doors closed permanently. The Morrison family made it known that the Whitmores were no longer welcome in their social circle, an exile that cost James some business connections, but which he bore with unexpected grace. But other doors opened. Families who'd been quietly sympathetic but too afraid to speak up began visiting. Ranchers who'd respected Ethan's work during the flood started offering jobs, fair jobs, with fair pay. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the community began to shift. Not everyone changed. Tommy Blake and his ilk still muttered threats when deep in their cups. Society matrons still crossed themselves when they saw Clara and Ethan together. The prejudice that had shaped their world didn't dissolve overnight, but it cracked. And in those cracks, something new began to grow. Spring came with the rush of melting snow and the creek running high with runoff. Clara stood on her porch, their porch, watching Ethan reinforce the sandbag barriers he'd built as a precaution, his movements efficient and sure. Her hand drifted to her stomach, to the subtle swell that Sarah had confirmed 2 weeks ago. She hadn't told Ethan yet, waiting for the right moment, wanting to be sure. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and smiled, a real smile, unguarded and warm in a way she'd once thought impossible from such a reserved man. He'd smiled more in the past months than in all the time she'd known him before, as though happiness was a muscle he'd forgotten how to use until she'd taught him to exercise it again. "What are you thinking about?" he called across the yard. "The future," Clara called back, "and how different it looks from what I imagined a year ago. Better or worse?" "Better. So much better, I can hardly believe it's real sometimes." He crossed to the porch, pulling her into his arms with easy affection that still made her heart race. "It's real. We're real. Everything we built, everything we survived to get here, all real. Even the parts that still hurt? The people who still hate us? The struggle that won't end just because we want it to? Especially those parts. The real parts aren't the easy ones, Clara. They're the ones we choose to face together anyway." She kissed him then, tasting spring and possibility and the promise of a future they'd forge on their own terms. When she pulled back, she took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "How do you feel about facing something new together?" she asked. "Something that'll be here around harvest time?" Ethan's eyes went wide, his hand spreading across her belly with wondering gentleness. We're going to have a baby. A child who'll be exactly what you feared, caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, but also loved fiercely by both parents who chose each other against all odds. Who'll teach them that strength isn't about fitting in, it's about being true to who you are. "Clara," his voice broke on her name. "Are you sure you want this? Want to bring a child into the struggle we've chosen?" "I've never been more sure of anything. This child will know hardship, yes, but they'll also know love. Real love, not the calculated kind my parents had. They'll know what it means to stand up for what's right even when it's hard, to judge people by their character instead of their bloodline, to build something real instead of accepting the broken world they inherited." Ethan pulled her close, his face buried in her hair, and Clara felt the tremor in his shoulders that meant he was fighting tears. "We're going to give them everything. Everything we didn't have. Everything we wished the world had been." "We're going to give them each other," Clara corrected. "That's more than enough." They stood like that for a long moment, two people who'd survived everything the world threw at them, now facing the future not with fear but with hope. The creek rushed past, high with spring melt, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out its hunting call. The fall that should have killed Clara had instead dropped her into a life far harsher and far more real than anything she'd been meant to survive. But she had survived. More than survived. She'd built something true with a man the world had dismissed, proved that love and courage mattered more than status or bloodlines, and in doing so had changed not just her own future, but the shape of the community around her. Not everyone would understand. Not everyone would approve. The struggle would continue, day by day, choice by choice. But standing on her porch with Ethan's arms around her and the future growing inside her, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. The only choice that mattered. She'd chosen truth over comfort, love over security, the hard, beautiful reality of a life earned through survival and stubbornness and refusing to let hatred win. And in the end, that choice had given her everything. The whispers would continue. The prejudice wouldn't disappear overnight. There would be hard days ahead, winters that tested their resilience, people who tested their patience, moments when the weight of the world's judgment felt too heavy to bear. But there would also be mornings like this one, standing together, watching spring transform the valley. There would be their child's first laugh, first steps, first moment of understanding that they were loved unconditionally. There would be victories small and large as they proved, day by day, that the impossible was achievable when two people refused to accept the limitations the world tried to impose. Clara had fallen from her horse into a desert that should have been her grave. Instead, Ethan Redhawk had stepped out of the dust and carried her into a life she'd never imagined. A life harder than anything she'd been raised for, but infinitely more precious because it was real. And when their child asked someday how their parents had met, Clara would tell them the truth. About a fall that became a beginning, about a stranger who became salvation, about choosing courage when comfort would have been easier, and finding that the hardest choices led to the greatest rewards. She would tell them that strength wasn't status, it was action. That love wasn't security, it was the willingness to stand beside someone through whatever came. That the world could be changed, one small corner at a time, by people brave enough to demand better. She would tell them they were the living proof of what happened when two people chose each other against all odds. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. And standing there on the porch of the house she'd built with her own hands, wrapped in the arms of the man who'd saved her life in every way that mattered, Clara knew her story had found its ending. Not a perfect ending, not a fairy tale where all the conflicts resolved and everyone lived happily ever after without struggle or pain, but a real ending, an honest one. A life forged in survival and stubbornness and love that proved stronger than the ugliness arrayed against it. The fall had dropped her into Ethan's path. But the choice to stay, to fight, to build something real in the ruins of her old life, that had been entirely hers. And she wouldn't change a single moment of it.